The young lady bowed politely and said with a smile that she would be working as a maid in the mansion today. She smiled and said that her name was Louise. She said with a smile that she relied very much on Miss Irenea. Irene looked at her intently, for she had been waiting for this day for a long time. She was very glad that the main character had finally returned. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise, but after asking for forgiveness, she said that she would like to ask her a question. She looked at her with a beaming smile and said that, as far as she knew, she was now her sunbase. Louise looked at the maid and said with a smile that she was the only maid in this mansion. Irenea looked at her intently, as she realized that she had already heard the same line 7 times. She smiled and said that she was very pleased to meet Irenea. She said that the work was difficult, but if you tried your best, everything would work out. The young maid was amazed by such a sincere and kind smile. She knew that today was the day when she would hand over all affairs to Louise. She knew that today she would finally submit the resignation letter that she had been carrying around for a long time. She was very happy because she understood that today was the day when she would be free from this game. In the game world, there is an influential mafia group called Nox, which has taken control of the entire criminal world. She was in the mansion of the high-ranking aristocratic family of Laurenti, who stands behind them. Having received a letter of recommendation from her previous master, the main character, Louise, got a job as a maid. The young lady, in turn, diligently performed her duties as a servant, after which she found herself involved with 3 young gentlemen, and that was the plot of the game. She was just a minor character here, even though she was a worker at the mansion just like Louise. Every time she turned on the game, she would say, "Greetings to Louise," with a radiant smile. She was just like an empty mannequin. Unfortunately, that was her essence. But she was a save point that needed to be spoken to in order to record gameplay. She was puzzled, as this was just a role imposed by the system. When she first got into this game, she thought that she would quickly be able to return to reality. She really wanted to quickly leave the game, but in turn, she wondered what the score of the attempt was. There's a reason for the game's decline. Towards the end, everyone was dying a horrible death. There was a time when the main character fell in love with the main character. She knew perfectly well that all the obvious failures were due to the pathetic endings. But such games usually had hidden protagonists. For this reason, she thought that everything would work out if she brought them together. But no matter how long she lived, she could not find even a hint of the hidden protagonist in her life. After the 6th ending, she returned to this life again. This was her 7th life in this game. Over the past few times, she had seen all the love endings, which she was glad about. And unfortunately, she also saw all the deadly endings. She not only watched the main character, but also helped her to see a new ending. But unfortunately, the results were disastrous for everyone, and she had a hard time. She was shocked because life was repeating itself as if laughing at her. And every time, after the ending, she returned to the moment of her first scene in the game. No matter what she did, she could not escape. She sighed heavily because she knew that if things were to turn out this way, she would want to throw everything away and live her life. She wanted to quit. She was glad because the main character came to their estate. She sighed heavily because she knew that if she left, the young lords would be a little sad. But she knew that they would quickly forget her and fall in love with the new maid because that was the system of the game. She knocked quietly on the door. The young man, without looking up from his documents, asked who was there. A moment later, she announced that it was she who had arrived. He smiled and said that she could come in. Entering the office, the young lady saw all the gentlemen gathered. Irenea was glad that they were all gathered. Otis greeted the maid and asked with a smile if she didn't like the rose he had folded. The second son of the Otis family, despite his striking features and gentle smile, he is the one in charge when it comes to the actions of their group. Archibald smiled and asked the lady what she had come for. He asked if she wanted anything. The eldest son, Archibald, anyone could say that he was a model gentleman with extremely good manners, but he was ruthless and did not hesitate to kill people. Rodon smiled and told his brother that the young lady had come to see him. Rodon is the youngest. He had a handsome face and a kind smile. He is very cruel and can torment the enemy for a long time until he stops breathing. From the outside, one could say that they have excellent genes, but they are dangerous people, worthy of being the Mafia's protection. She looked at them intently and said that she had come to see the elder gentleman. The young people were disappointed. She slowly placed a sheet of paper on his table. Archibald looked at the sheet in surprise and asked what she had brought him. She looked at him intently and said that she had brought her resignation letter as she was going to leave the mansion. The young people froze in shock. They had not expected to hear anything like that. When she saw Archibald's surprised face, the scene of the final ending, the death of Louise and Archibald suddenly flashed before her eyes. Archibald pursued Louise, who betrayed him, and fled to the enemy camp. He said angrily that it wasn't funny. Louise froze in place, she couldn't move. He looked at her coldly and asked if she really thought she could leave him like that. The young lady was shocked because she saw that he was covered in blood. He looked at her intently and hugged her tightly, saying that if she were with him, he could promise her unbreakable peace and tranquility. He sighed heavily and said that he only needed her, but it seemed that this was not mutual. He looked at her intently and said that he loved her very much. A moment later, he drew his sword, and after his words, he stabbed her and himself with the sword. By dying with her, he tied her to himself forever. The young lady in turn was shocked by this scene. Archibald looked at her with fury and said that it wasn't even funny. He asked if she really thought that she could leave him like that. She froze in shock and didn't understand why. He gave her the line from that ending. She froze when he tore up her application. She was very puzzled since she just wanted to quit. Irenea wondered if it was really necessary to react so strongly to this. He looked at her with fury and said that he would now pretend that he had not heard it. The young lady looked at everyone present and said that she would leave anyway. Archibald looked at her with fury and said that it seemed like she didn't even want to hear him. He looked at her intently and said he wouldn't repeat it twice. Otis walked up to the young lady and hugged her tenderly. He told his brother to stop behaving like that as he was putting the young lady in an awkward position. The young lady looked at Otis as she knew he always had a warm smile. But now he was cold, like a completely different person. In all the time she had played the game, she had never seen him look so terrifying. She was surprised because he was cold and calm. He looked at her intently and asked if she really wanted to leave. The young lady hesitated, but a moment later said that she wanted to leave as she had already made up her mind. He looked at her intently and said that with such a strong will, it would be difficult to convince her. She froze in surprise. Otis kissed her hand tenderly and said that in that case she could take him with her. The young lady froze in shock and asked in surprise what he was talking about. She sighed heavily and, pushing him away, said that he himself knew perfectly well that this was simply impossible. He was a little angry and said that he would give her anything she wanted and she wouldn't have to work as hard as she did now. He smiled and said that it was enough to just drink tea with him once a day. He smiled and said that it would be enough if they walked and spent time together. He smiled and said that it would be nice if there was a riding field near the estate. He imagined the young lady riding a horse well. He knew that she could take her time and enjoy the dinner prepared by the best chef. He looked closely at the young lady and asked her how she felt about the idea. Archibald looked at his brother with fury and called him. He walked up to his brother with lightning speed and told him to control himself. Archibald looked at the lady and told her to ignore his brother's nonsense. Archibald said that his brother did not have enough money and that he was only skillfully bluffing. Otis sighed heavily and asked his brother what he was talking about. He asked if he really thought he didn't have that kind of money. Archibald said that he had little money compared to him. The young lady froze in place, watching their squabble. She sighed heavily, knowing that it would have been better if they had accepted her statement quietly. Archibald approached the lady and asked if he had offended her in any way, or if another worker had offended her. He looked at her closely and said that he thought she got along well with everyone. He didn't understand what the problem was. She said she was just thinking about opening a small cafe with her savings. He was surprised that she was going into business. She smiled and said that everything was fine, and that was what she wanted, as she dreamed of living a calm and quiet life in a cafe. Rodon shouted that this simply couldn't be. He was very angry. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted to leave them just because of this. He said that she knew that he couldn't wake up without her. He looked at her intently and said that he didn't even want to imagine the morning without her. The young lady gently stroked his face and said with a smile that everything was fine. She smiled and said that he would quickly get used to the days without her, and the young master she knew would overcome everything. Rodon was shocked, as he did not expect to hear something like this. He quickly hugged her, and with tears in his eyes said that he would not let her go under any circumstances. She sighed heavily, as she knew that it would be difficult for her to leave work. Otis told his brother to get away from her. He was putting the young lady in an awkward position. Rodon was shocked. He shouted that the young lady did not think so at all. Irenea looked at them intently, and asking Rodon for forgiveness, understood that Otis was right this time. Otis smiled and told the young lady to ignore Radion's meteor. He told the young lady that the most important thing now was her plan to leave her job. He looked at her intently and said that, for such a dream, there was no need to go far, and everything was quite solvable. She asked what he was talking about. He looked at his brother with a satisfied grin and asked if he was right. Archibald smiled at the young lady and said that they could simply tell the butler to convert the extension into a cafe. She was shocked because she realized that they were all on the same page. Otis looked at the lady and asked with a smile if she had heard he said that they could go together. Rodon was in shock. He shouted that he would also go with them. Otis looked at his brother with fury in his eyes and told him to stop his hysteria. He sighed heavily and upset said that he would go and look for coffee beans. As he left, he said that it would be better this way. Archibald looked at his brother and said that he needed to go to Delton. He said that someone had invaded their territory. He looked at his brother with fury and asked if the worms from the southern region had finally started moving. Otis smiled and said that those guys wouldn't dare attack, and someone must have provoked them. Archibald looked at his brother and said that he would have to go too. The young man was surprised. He did not expect to hear such a thing. Archibald said with a grin that for this reason, he would be decorating the cafe together with the lady. He looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that he would be by her side. She sighed heavily because she knew that once she got involved with the Mafia, she wouldn't be able to refuse the bloodshed viewing. She sighed heavily and, asking for forgiveness, said that her decision was immutable. She said that she would leave their mansion immediately. They were shocked and told her to think again. She said that of course she dreams of opening a cafe, but she also wants love. But relationships are forbidden in the mansion. They were surprised that the agreement contained a clause stating that relationships were prohibited at work. They looked at Archibald and asked if he had come up with it. She said that the clause was added after workers were caught violating the code of conduct. The young people remembered how there had recently been a similar incident, and the servants began to blame each other. They acted like lovers, and then each said that he had been used and asked for forgiveness. Archibald looked at the young people and told them to stop talking, since they were all already dead. He looked at the lady intently and said that if this was bothering her, she should have told him about it earlier. Otis looked at his brother and asked if this rule only applied to employees. He said it did not apply to them. He slowly approached the young lady and, kneeling, took her hand. He smiled and asked her if she would like to become his girlfriend and future wife. The young lady froze in shock. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that she should think carefully. He said that it didn't differ much from her condition. He smiled and said that many couples love each other, even in arranged marriages, and they could do the same. He smiled and said that they would have a beautiful child like his mother and father. She quickly covered his mouth with her hand. Irenea looked at him with embarrassment and said that their fun had gone too far. He looked at her intently and asked, what if this wasn't a joke? He came even closer to her and said with a smile on his face that he was always serious about her. Rodon looked at his brother with fury and told him to stop immediately. He angrily asked his brother if he couldn't see that the young lady didn't like him. Otis, in turn, looked at his brother with fury and told him not to talk nonsense about things he himself did not know. Rodon said that if he were in the young lady's place, he would slap him. She looked intently at the young people and said that if they continued like this in the future, she would go and pack her things. Rodon apologized for putting her in an awkward position. He asked if he could apologize to her. He looked at the young lady and said that sometimes his brother had no manners. He asked the lady if she needed this. Love people can't. He said that people can't be trusted. He asked the lady what she would say if they got a pet and took care of it. He said that they would live a happy life. She said she liked people more than animals, and she didn't want all her clothes to be covered in wool. He looked intently at the young lady and said that she alone was enough for him. He asked what she liked and said that he would listen to everything only she had to say. The young lady, in turn, only wanted to quit. Archibald looked at his brother and told him to calm down and let the lady go. He looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that his brother was now being rude to the one who could become his daughter-in-law. Archibald smiled and said that it would be nice to propose on a date. He said he hadn't thought about a relationship, but if that's what she wanted, she could date him. The young lady looked coldly at the young men and said that she could not do that. Archibald looked at her with a smile and asked why she couldn't do it. She shouted that she had no intention of meeting them since they were mafiosi. She asked them to give her a large severance pay and let her go. She was puzzled because she knew she couldn't, so to speak. Irenea sighed heavily and said that she would appreciate their offers, but it was too great an honor for her. Archibald said that it was not so. He looked at her closely and asked if she didn't like them. He said that she could have chosen one of them. She sighed heavily as she realized that she had dug her own grave. The young lady began to speak, but suddenly, Louise burst into their room. She glanced sideways at Louise as she understood that the girl had arrived just in time. Louise smiled and greeted them. She introduced herself and said that she had arrived with a letter of recommendation from Lich Fen. She said she would like to discuss salary if they were not busy. Irenea, in turn, understood perfectly well that she was very guilty before Louise, but now she had a wonderful idea. A moment later, she said she had found the right person. She looked at them and said that she would not agree without Miss Louise. Louise froze in shock. She didn't understand what they were talking about. She knew that she was always scolded for being slow. Unfortunately, every day she was punished with additional work, although she could not cope with the main one. She looked at the young lady and thanked her for choosing her. Louise told Lady that she would never disappoint her. Irenea looked at the girl and told her to calm down. Otis looked at them and said that this was just nonsense. He told the lady that he knew her as a person who was not influenced by emotions. He asked if she now wanted to say that she fell in love with the maid at first sight. Archibald said that he couldn't believe it, since they were seeing each other for the first time. Rodon said that he agreed with the brothers. Rodon looked at the girl and said that she was a young woman who had not paid her debt and was now living with him. The young lady hesitated, not knowing what to answer. She pulled back a little from him, but Rodon still advanced. He quietly but angrily asked her if he could tell her how to get rid of him. He said that she could join the organization and do contract work. He said that the salary was not bad. The young lady was shocked. She shouted for him to stop. She did not understand why he was telling her all this. With tears in her eyes, she looked at him and said that she would not do such a thing because she could not. Irenea began to calm the young lady. Louise said that she was very scared. Rodon, in turn, was furious. Rodon looked at the young lady with fury as she made him very nervous. He looked at his brother and said they could just kick her out. Archibald said with a grin that they would do just that, but first they would do something. He looked at them intently and said that it would not hurt to take care of this pampered soul. The young lady was in shock. She simply could not believe what had happened, since she knew that the previous times they loved Louise. She wondered if they were just abandoning her now. She quietly comforted the maid as she cried on her shoulder. She understood perfectly well that if she left everything as it was, Louise would be in danger. She looked at the young people with fury as she understood that all her plans had gone to waste. The young lady looked at the young gentleman with fury and told them to listen to her. She said that if they threatened Louise, she would die with her. Otis was taken aback, and looking at the young lady said that it was just a joke. Rodon smiled and said that they couldn't have said that seriously. Archibald said they had gone a bit overboard, meaning they had no intention of putting what they said into practice. He looked at the maid and, asking for forgiveness, said that they could not hire her. She was surprised. He looked at her intently and said that he didn't like her silver hair. Otis said she looked very weak. Rodon said she was crying disgustingly loudly. Louise looked at them and said that in that case, she would dye her hair and become stronger and never cry again. She looked at them intently and asked them not to throw her out. Archibald said that they already had enough servants. Archibald looked at her and said with fury that he had not asked for a new servant and had no idea how she had gotten there. She said she had a letter of introduction from Mrs. Henrietta. Otis said with a grin that his mother lived quite freely. Rodon looked at the lady in surprise and asked if his mother had said anything. Shaking with fear, Louise said that his mother had not passed on anything. Archibald sighed heavily and said that since she was on Otis's mother's recommendation, he couldn't kick her out. She looked at him intently and asked if this meant she could work on the estate. Archibald sighed heavily and said that it was okay. She would work here. Louise was very happy and shouted that she would try her best. The young lady looked at Louise closely and felt relieved that she would not be thrown out. The rest looked at them and said that since the conversation was over, she would leave them. Archibald looked at the lady and said that they needed to talk some more. Irenea looked at him and said that she had already announced her resignation and her deputy had arrived. She did not understand why she needed to stay any longer. Of course, from the very first day in the mansion, she took care of them. It was a little sad to leave them. Louise, excited, looked at the lady and asked if she was really quitting. She was shocked because she was so protective of her, and now she just leaves. Louise hugged the lady tightly and told her that she could not leave, as she had not yet thanked her. Louise looked at the lady in surprise and asked if she was okay. Irenea, in turn, thought that she would start a new life again after a strong hug. She looked at Louise intently and said that she had already told her everything. Archibald looked at the lady and called her. He said that she seemed to be in a very strong mood. He asked if she had already bought a house for herself where she would live. The young people were shocked. They called their brother and asked what he was talking about. She looked at him and said that she was planning to stay at a hotel near the capital for now. He looked at her closely and asked why she didn't put off resigning until then. He said she could stay just a month and they would gather their courage. Archibald looked at the lady with a smile and said that she could teach Miss Louise everything for now, and for this, he would double her salary. Louise looked closely at the young lady and told her to stay a little longer. She looked at the young gentleman intently and said that she would work for another month if he tripled her salary. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that in that case they could rewrite the contract and she could demand whatever she wanted. He looked closely at Louise and said that it seemed like she wanted to talk about her rate. She said that she would like to change the bank where her salary would be sent. He smiled and said that they could discuss it, and also apologized for causing her trouble in the first place. She smiled and said that it was no big deal, and she would be happy to try her best for them. He smiled and said that she should learn well from the young lady. A moment later, he said that they could leave. Louise, with a radiant smile, took the young lady's hand and said that they would go together. Archibald sighed heavily and said that now that the main thing was done, it was time for them to take care of the rest. He told Rodon to deal with the trespassers on their territory, and Otis should contact the realtor and prevent the lady from renting the apartment. Otis looked at his brother and told him not to take his anger out where it wasn't needed. He smiled and said that he was assigned to sort things out and that he was sent to the realtor. He said with a satisfied smile that it was all because he easily got rid of everything he didn't like. Otis said with a grin that it was all because he was neither handsome nor a gentleman. Rodon looked at his brother with fury. He was very angry. Archibald looked at the young men and told them to stop and both be silent. He looked at Otis and told him to act secretly. He said that if they couldn't change the young lady's mind, then their only option was to force her to stay. They looked at their older brother and said that they understood everything and would do everything. He realized that Lickfein had sent a maid. He knew that she lived a very quiet life, but suddenly she had thought of something. He looked intently at his subordinate and told him to go to Lichfen immediately. Archibald told his subordinate that he needed to find out something. The man said that he would do everything. Archibald knew perfectly well that he needed her to understand that her tricks weren't working. The lady said with a grin that the gears were already moving, and she was in anticipation of what would happen in the future. She knew the boys wouldn't get away quietly, but she wanted to see what would happen after they got the bait. Louise looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile what she should do today. Irenea knew perfectly well that the most important thing was now beginning. In the original, there were the charm paths of Rodon and Archibald. She knew they were different, but each of them led to different endings. In Otis's case, the latter was constant. She knew it perfectly well, but she didn't know where to start. A moment later, she said that she could do a little tidying up at Mr. Rodion's place while she tidied up Otis's room. Louise said with a charming and playful smile that she understood everything. She looked closely at Louise because she knew that Louise had suffered last time. But now she wanted to send Louise on her way. She wanted to not influence the ending any more than she did now. A moment later, she knocked on the door and entered the young master's room. He looked at her intently and with a smile asked for forgiveness for his appearance. She smiled and said that everything was fine because it was his room. She said that she would light a fire so that he wouldn't catch a cold. He smiled and said that since she said so, everything was fine. A moment later, he came up to her and called out. She asked in surprise what he wanted. Otis smiled and said that he wanted to ask about what happened during the day. He said that his brothers decided to leave everything as it was. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he liked certainty. Otis asked the lady if he really shouldn't hope. She froze in place as she found it all very strange. She knew that at this point he usually turned away and sat on the edge of the bed as if offended. The young lady pushed him away a little and asked him to control himself. She was surprised as he was now behaving completely differently. He said he was joking because she was leaving soon, and he decided to lighten the mood a little. He said he couldn't live without her. She looked at him and said that he looked too cheerful to be true. He looked at her in surprise. He smiled and said that he had finished the work faster than he had expected today, and it was funny to look at their regretful faces. He came closer to her and said that if they had not made the wrong choice from the very beginning, they would not have died in vain. He looked at the lady intently and asked if she thought the same. She felt his hands on her fragile neck and understood that he was trying to convince her with fear. She understood that this was very similar to him. A moment later, Louise burst into the room with a smile on her face and called out to the young lady. She froze in surprise at the door and said that she was finished. A moment later, she screamed angrily and asked the gentleman what he was doing. Irenea was surprised. She did not expect to see Louise here, since she was directing her to the room of the other master. A moment later, Louise stood in front of the gentleman and blocked the young lady with her body. She shouted for him to stop. She screamed that she didn't know what the lady had done wrong, but trying to strangle her and throw her into the fireplace was too much. The young man was shocked. He looked at Louise and asked what she was saying. She screamed that she had seen everything. Irene said that everything was wrong. Louise screamed that everything was fine, and she would protect her. The young master froze in shock and stared at his hands. He looked at Louise intently and said that she entered the room without knocking. He came closer to her and said angrily that she was even trying to blame him. He asked if she was really tired of living. Louise froze in shock. She was trembling and did not know what to answer. He asked where all her courage had gone. He looked at her with a smirk and said that they would be against it if she decided to stay in the mansion after the punishment. He said that if she was scared, then Irenea. He did not have time to finish speaking, as she shouted that he could punish her. Louise looked at the young gentleman intently and said that she had disturbed his peace. Irenea was shocked. She did not expect at all that Louise would stand up for her. He looked at the lady intently and asked if she had heard everything he said that she could go. Louise looked at the lady and said with a smile that she was fine and she could trust her. Irenea knew that Louise was the main character, but she was worried that it might not save her. She saw that the young master was in some strange state. She was puzzled as everything was very confused. She sighed heavily as she had no intention of doing anything with it. A moment later, she was taken aback as someone grabbed her shoulder and pulled her. Archibald looked at her closely and with a smile said that she should behave quietly. She was surprised. He smiled and said that he heard some loud sounds, and even the mansion shook from them. She looked at him intently and asked for 1 minute, and also apologized. She smiled and said that judging by the way his tie was loose, he really was in a hurry. Archibald smiled and said that he was indeed in a hurry. He looked at the lady intently and said that he was very worried and wanted to ask her something. He smiled and looking at the lady, asked if she would answer him honestly. He looked closely at the young lady and asked if she really loved Louise. She said that love was indeed a wonderful thing. She looked at him intently and asked if it was strange that she loved someone. Archibald came closer to her and said that there was nothing strange about it. He looked at her intently and calmly said that he was very sorry that she did not love him. She knew this answer wasn't for a minor character. She thought he was trying to divert her attention from Louise. Irenea wondered if this was some kind of unconscious defensiveness. She moved away from the young master. She said she thought for a moment about the reason for his treatment of her in this way. He looked at the young lady with a soft and radiant smile. She in turn knew that in the end he would be with the main character. He sighed heavily and said that it turned out that nothing even surprised her, judging by her reaction. He said that it seemed like he had started this conversation in vain. He looked closely at the young lady and said that he had the feeling that she always knew everything. She froze in surprise. Then he said that she was always sure of everything. Archibald looked at her intently and said that for that reason, no matter what she said, he could not help but believe her. Archibald looked at the young lady tenderly. She did not know what to answer him. He asked the lady if he ever disappointed her, whether she could continue to trust him. The young lady looked at him with a smile and said that of course she would believe him. She knew that she could talk a little later. Irene looked at him with a tender smile and said that it was true, and even in spite of this, she would always believe him. He froze in surprise. Louise looked at the rose in surprise and told the lady to look too, as spring had just arrived, and the roses were already blooming in the garden. Louise said with a smile that they were undoubtedly raised by someone's love. She knew that even though this was a game, the laws of nature could not be ignored. Irene looked at Louise and asked if she was hiding something. Louise was taken aback and said that she was not. She looked closely at the flower as she saw that someone had attached them, but she wanted to pretend that she had not noticed anything. Louise smiled and said that she was very curious as to whose love such beautiful flowers bloomed in the garden. She looked closely at the lady as she saw that she was interested in the matter. Irenia, looking at the flower, understood that this was completely a success for Mr. Otis. Otis asked why Irenia and Louise were so protective of each other, since they barely knew each other. Otis shouted that if Irene had understood romance, he would have tried a little harder. Otis thought that maybe then he could make Irenia fall in love with him. Louise looked closely at the young master as she realized something. Louise asked the young gentleman if he really liked Irenea. Otis looked at her with a smile and said that otherwise he would not have been jealous of Irenea towards her. He sighed heavily and said that unfortunately she did not have feelings for him. Louise screamed that this was not yet known. She looked closely at the young master and said with a smile that she would help them. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she would really help the man who had just threatened her. Louise smiled and said that he couldn't kick her out as long as she helped him, and she couldn't pass by when it came to love. Louise smiled and said that she would bring them together through Cupid's resignation, and that it was just her dream. The young master was taken aback. He did not expect to hear anything like this from the maid. He said that now she must clean for him regularly and must report everything that happens with Irenia. She smiled and said that it was simply wonderful to use the roses prepared yesterday for a romantic surprise. The lady looked at Louise and said that it was time for them to go. Louise asked in surprise if they were really not going to look at the flowers anymore. Irene said that they were of course very beautiful, but they had a lot of work. Louise said that she was very sorry as she wanted to walk around the garden some more. She told Louise not to worry, as she would often be walking in the garden. She thought for a moment and said that in her 70 years of work. A moment later, she was taken aback and said that she had been working here for 10 years and often looked into the garden. Louise looked at her in surprise. Louise asked the lady in surprise if she had really been working here since she was 15. Irenea said that it turned out that way. Louise smiled and said that after trying as many times, she would also be able to do everything without mistakes. She smiled and said that by then, she would probably get along as well with the young gentleman as she did. Louise looked at her intently and said that they did treat her in a special way. Irenea sighed heavily and became thoughtful as she saw that the lords had become friendly with her, which was very strange. She was puzzled because they were obsessed with her and not Louise. She wondered if all this was because of that incident. She sighed heavily and decided to throw the thoughts away as she knew that the game began with the arrival of the main character. A moment later, the young ladies were taken aback as they heard someone calling for a doctor. The man shouted to the maid not to stand rooted to the spot, but rather not to weaken. They were surprised and did not know who did it. Lady froze in surprise as she knew that this had not happened before. Louise froze in shock as she didn't expect to see something like this. She shouted that it was the young master. She quickly rushed towards him. Irenea froze in shock, knowing he had not been injured that seriously. She was confused and didn't understand what was going on. She knew that she had to calm down and think she thought that this was the plot of Louise and the gentleman, after which she had to start courting him. She understood perfectly well what she had to do for the two of them in this situation. She said they should move it to the second floor. The madam looked mockingly at everyone present and said that their estate was a mess. The servants froze in shock. She looked at everyone present with a smirk and asked if they really dared to still call themselves Knox. Everyone present was very surprised, as they did not expect to see Mrs. Veronica. She sat up slowly and looked at everyone with a smirk on her face. She smiled and said that they could ignore her and go about their business. She said with a smirk that they had more urgent matters to attend to than her. A moment later, she clearly saw who was in charge of all the servants in the estate. She heard that Archibald had given her the powers of headmaid. She looked at the maid with a smirk because she realized that Henrietta was right. She wanted to start slowly. She looked at the young man and said that she was going to break something now, but before that, she would give him a chance to explain. The man was taken aback and asked for forgiveness, as they had not been informed of her visit. She looked at him with fury and asked if she really needed to report to everyone. She said that footmen should be flexible. She said with a grin that apparently this position was occupied by the worst of the servants. She did not understand how much she would worry about her nephews. She looked at the young lady intently and asked her about it. The young lady sighed heavily and asked her mistress for forgiveness. Lady Veronica asked with a grin why she was being punished like this. Veronica sighed heavily and said that they don't know how to greet and they don't know etiquette. She looked at everyone present with a smirk and asked what they were worth. She said that they should be on their knees. Moments later, all the servants bowed to her. She looked at them intently with a smirk on her face. Veronica looked closely at the young lady and asked why she was with them. Irenea looked at her with bewilderment and said that now she was responsible. Veronica looked at the lady and said that she was an exception because she was the one who took care of her nephews. She smiled and said that they could have a cup of tea. She looked at Mrs. Veronica in surprise and asked if she hadn't come to the young owners. Veronica smiled and said that it wasn't urgent. She said with a grin that if she was with her, they would crawl to her themselves. She said that she just wanted to visit the girl whom she sent to the estate. She said with a grin that she was very glad that the girl was now taking care of the younger one. After all, Henrietta had recommended her. She said with a grin that initially she wanted her nephews to hand over Knox to her and live in peace. She looked at the young lady with a smirk and said that then no one would have to go through all this trouble. She looked at the young man intently and asked why all the servants were so listless. She said that they would perk up if they had holes in their heads. Irenea saw that the mistress was unobtrusively intimidating the servants. She saw that Veronica was creating the atmosphere she needed. Veronica looked at them with a smirk and said that she didn't know if she would like the tea. Nothing could be worse than their behavior. She smiled and said that the scent was simply wonderful. Veronica said that she had found it with great difficulty, especially for Irenea. Veronica looked at the maid with a radiant smile and said that it seemed that sincerity would help her drink the tea to the bottom. The young lady looked at her with bewilderment, but said nothing. She wondered for a moment if this had happened before. She was a little puzzled, because she had a familiar feeling. Veronica looked closely at the lady, and with a sly grin, told her to drink tea. She looked closely at the cup of tea as she smelled the faintest scent of rose. It was painfully familiar to her. A moment later, Archibald approached the young lady, and looking at Veronica, said that they had an important topic of conversation. He was surprised that she used tea on the maid. Irenea looked at the older gentleman in surprise. Veronica looked at the young people with a grin. She knew that Henrietta's prediction was wrong. She looked at them intently because she understood that now everything would become much more interesting. She looked at Archibald with a smile and said that there had been a small misunderstanding. She said that she just wanted to treat the girl to a cup of delicious tea. He looked at her closely and said that of course he understood her. Archibald asked if that was really the name for everything that could be added to boiled water. He looked at her angrily and said that the tea might be poisoned. A moment later, with anger and fury, he poured the cup of tea on the table. Everyone present was surprised by such an act of the young man. A few minutes later, he threw the cup on the table, and it shattered with a loud crash. Veronica was shocked. She couldn't understand how he dared to do such a thing. She looked at him with a smirk and asked if he really wanted to humiliate her. Archibald looked at his aunt with fury and asked if she would deny that she had started it all first. He was furious because she had dared to use dope on a man from the Laurenti family. She sighed heavily and said that she could joke a little. She asked if it was news to him that they had left Yunnan. She said that he had not batted an eye when they were driven out of Liefen. Archibald looked at her with fury and said that they had extorted a large sum of money. He asked if she was now trying to take Irene away. She looked at him intently and said that she would tell him everything straight. Veronica said that they should have received this money. Maybe then the servants would have gotten some too. She said with a smile that every person wants to have an experienced and knowledgeable person next to them. She looked intently at Archibald and asked if he really had feelings for the maid. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that being indifferent to subordinates could not be called the head of the family. She said with a grin that it was very strange. She looked at Archibald closely and said with a smirk that for some reason in her eyes, he looked as if he was protecting his beloved. Louise sighed heavily. She was worried that she had not had a single day of peace since she came to the estate and was almost kicked out. She looked at the young master intently and said that he almost died today. She sighed heavily and said that a weight had been lifted from her shoulders when she saw that he was healthy. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that he should not worry, as she would not reveal his secret. She smiled and said that she would keep it a secret. A moment later, the young gentleman threw a pillow at her with the speed of lightning. She froze in surprise. He looked at her with embarrassment, but anger, and told her that she should behave quietly. She looked at him closely and said with a smile that he didn't need to be so shy at all. She said that puppies sometimes pretend to be sick. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she had really called him an animal. He sighed heavily and said that if it weren't for her, he would now be next to Louise. Thought for a moment. She looked at the young man intently and asked if he was talking about Miss Irene. He was very surprised as she suddenly screamed. Louise looked at the young gentleman intently and asked if he was pretending to be ill to attract her attention. He froze in place with embarrassment and did not answer. A moment later, the young gentleman, in a hurry and confusion, shouted that Louise knew nothing. She smiled and said that everything was fine, since she would have done the same. He froze in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She said with a loving smile that even in her womanly eyes, Irene was a wonderful person. Louise said that the young lady was well-rounded and graceful in every movement. She said that she wished to be as perfect a person as she was. Louise smiled and said that when she learned that the young lady would be his every morning, she hadn't finished speaking before he shouted at her that she must stop. He looked at her in surprise and asked how she knew such a thing. She looked intently at the young man and said that, of course, Irene had told her everything. He looked at her in surprise and happily asked if she was talking about him. Louise sighed heavily and said that it was exactly like that because she wanted to hand over all the affairs to her. She looked at the young master intently and said that she had something to do now. She was a little surprised because she saw that his face had changed and he was very upset. A moment later, he wrapped the blanket tightly around her and said that none of this mattered and she should go. He said that now she should leave as he wanted to be alone. Louise froze in shock. She looked at the young master intently and said that if other servants came, they would quickly realize that he was pretending. He sighed heavily and said that it did not matter since Irene would also come to him. Louise looked at the master intently and said that then the young lady would figure everything out. She looked at him intently and, throwing the blanket off the gentleman, said that if he really wanted to pass for sick, he should pretend that something hurt him. Rodon shouted that he was not pretending at all and that it was half true. He was in shock and did not understand how she realized that he was pretending. Louise looked at him intently and said with a smile that she had often seen this since childhood. She said her father was constantly beaten by debt collectors. Rodon looked at her intently as he remembered the duty she had spoken of earlier. A moment later, they heard a scream. They turned around in surprise and looked in the direction from which the noise and screams were coming. He sighed heavily as he realized that it was his aunt who was screaming. He knew that it was difficult to quietly agree with her character. He was surprised and did not understand what had made her so angry. Veronica sighed heavily and said that they could assume that he was telling the truth. She looked at him in surprise and asked if she understood correctly that he was doing this to protect his servants. Archibald looked at his aunt with fury and said that if she had come here to throw words around, then she might as well leave already. He looked at her with fury and a smirk and said that he did not have as much time as some people. Veronica was furious. She screamed and called him. She did not understand how he dared to look down on her. She asked furiously if he thought he would have gone this far without her. Veronica said with fury and anger that first of all, she was not his aunt, but Knox's consigliere. She looked at him with disdain and said that he should not pose in front of someone he does not have the strength to face. The lady looked closely at the scandal. She understood that if they continued in the same spirit, there would be problems. With the speed of lightning, she stood up and asked the lady to calm down a little. Veronica was furious. She pushed the young lady away and shouted at her to mind her own business. She shouted at the maid to stay out of the way. Archibald was shocked. He quickly caught the young lady, who fell right on top of him. Irene screamed in pain. Archibald looked at his aunt with fury and shouted. A moment later, Otis entered the room and fired a shot into the air. Everyone was shocked as they did not expect such a thing from him. He looked at them with fury and said that there was no one to be seen in the garden and the house was noisy, and that this was not the only thing that was bothering him so much. He looked at his aunt with a grin and asked if it wouldn't be better to get rid of them all at once. Veronica looked at him intently and said with fury that he was still the same selfish person, just like his mother. He looked at her with fury and said that she knew perfectly well that after these words, not one or two people disappeared. He said with a grin that it seemed like she was tired of her position. Veronica smiled and said that these were very loud statements from a brat who would not last a minute in her position. She said with a grin that they were all good at talking. She didn't have time to finish speaking when suddenly a shot rang out. The man who was standing next to her fell dead to the ground. Veronica was in shock. She didn't understand how this could happen. She looked at the young man with fury and shouted that it would be very noisy if his mother found out about this. Veronica said that she would be worried, even despite her infatuation with her lover. Irene looked at them intently. She knew that she needed to calm them down, and before it got any worse, but unfortunately, she was suffocating. Archibald looked at the young lady and handed her a handkerchief. He told her to take it, and if possible, not to inhale the steam. Trembling, she thanked the young gentleman. Archibald said angrily that ordinary people were vulnerable to that scent, so she had to be careful. He said she could trust the situation to Otis. He turned around and saw her falling to the ground. The young master was in shock. A moment later, he saw her fall to the ground. He screamed, but it was all in vain. Veronica looked at the young people with a smirk and said that a simple servant had lost consciousness. She asked with a smirk why they had become so gloomy. She asked if they thought they were overreacting. The young lady in turn fell down to soften the situation, but she understood that it was unsafe to continue inhaling this aroma. She was puzzled as she knew that Madame was targeting her, and therefore the news that the young masters had reacted strongly to her resignation letter had reached Lichfen. She thought that Louise was most likely not to blame for this, but according to the plot, all the information about Lavrenti was transmitted through her letters. This time, she has no information to draw a conclusion about the situation, only the usual greetings and everyday conversations. She wondered if there was a spy in the house other than Louise. She knew she had to find him and expose him, and Archibald looked at her intently and asked why she was behaving like this. She looked at him with a grin and said that not even a day had passed since her incense had been laced with a paralytic incense. Veronica looked at the young lady with fury and said that, of course, for ordinary people, it could be fatal. Irenea understood perfectly well that a simple girl could not be immune to this. She was puzzled since the poison tea and intoxicating incense had an effect on her. Archibald was furious because he was unable to control the situation. He looked closely at his aunt, as he knew that he needed to distract her from the young lady. He knew that if they were late, the antidote would not work. Archibald looked at his brother closely. He wanted him to help him resolve this situation a little. Otis looked at Veronica with fury. He was very angry and also wanted to finish everything as quickly as possible. Archibald looked at his aunt and asked what she knew that she had treated some maid that way. Otis sighed heavily and said that they would have to get rid of another body. Archibald told his brother to bring the butler. He looked closely at the young lady and said that although she was a simple maid, she had worked in their house for a long time, and they could not leave things like that. Veronica looked at the young man with intense and furious eyes. She understood that he wanted to distract her, but she knew that it was too late. Archibald looked at his aunt and said that he allowed her to torment their servants. He allowed her to do this because their lives were not in danger. He said angrily that he was intervening now, not because she was a maid, some special person, and not because they didn't like her. He looked at her angrily and said that everything was over because she had attempted on the life of a person working in their house. Archibald said with hatred and fury that she had crossed the line. Veronica looked at him with a smirk and said that the most important thing he couldn't tell her. She looked at him intently. She knew that he could pretend as much as he wanted, but she felt that everything inside him was burning. She looked closely at the young lady, as she felt a little sorry for her, but she knew it was too late. She knew that a lot of time had passed, and her awakening would be a miracle. A moment later, she looked at her subordinate and told him to give her something. The young lady, in turn, hoped that she would soon wake up in her real world. Archibald looked at the envelope in surprise and asked what was in it. Veronica said with a smirk that it was a gift from Henrietta. She said that they should read it and answer her personally. A moment later, she looked at them with a smirk and said that it was time for her to go about her business. A moment later, Archibald shouted to everyone present to open the windows immediately and quickly obtain antidotes. Everyone began to carry out the young master's order in a hurry. Archibald rushed to the young lady he called her, but it was all in vain. He saw how she was shaking. Archibald looked intently at the young lady and asked if she could hear him. She in turn quietly called him. He looked at her worriedly and said that it seemed the dope had not yet spread throughout her body. He looked at her intently and said that unfortunately, she would feel bad, but she must be patient. He saw that she was losing consciousness again. Rodon ran out of the room and called the young lady. The young people were excited. They did not expect to see anything like this. Louise, with tears in her eyes, asked the young lady to stand up. She told her that she had so much she wanted to tell her. Rodon looked closely at the young lady and asked if she recognized him. He wanted to know if she felt his hand and if she felt dizzy. She looked closely at the young master and asked if he was in pain, as she knew he was injured, but he in turn shouted that now was not the time to worry about him. He was in shock and shaking with fear, saying that he should worry about her and what condition she was in now. He screamed furiously that he would kill Veronica because of what she had done. Louise looked at everyone present with fear and asked if she should bring the doctor. Rodon looked at her with fury and asked what she thought. He shouted that even a small dose of dope paralyzes the body. He shouted that this poison could stop breathing. The young lady was in shock. She screamed with tears in her eyes that this could not be, and her friend could not die like this. He looked at her with fury and shouted that they could not let her die. To the young lady, Rodon's words sounded ever quieter, and her own breathing grew weaker. Archibald was furious. He understood that there was no time, and no one had brought them an antidote. A moment later, the butler shouted to the young master that he had found the antidote. Louise grabbed the bottle and shouted that she would do it herself. She looked at the lady and said that it was an antidote and she must drink it. She asked the young lady to drink it, but unfortunately, she could not swallow it. He snatched the bottle from her hands. Archibald was furious. He knew that if they delayed any longer, her condition would get out of control. He understood perfectly well that he could not come to terms with this. He was furious and simply could not lose her. With lightning speed, he kissed her and thereby poured the antidote into her. Opening her eyes, the young lady was taken aback as she realized that she was once again in a place of memories. She sighed heavily as she realized that she had most likely simply lost consciousness, but she was puzzled by the fact that, unfortunately, she did not remember how it happened. She remembered that she had decided to leave the mansion and the young gentleman. She thought that she could get away from them. The young lady sighed heavily as she realized that she most likely still had feelings for them. She knew there was something she had to do before she left. A moment later, she was taken aback as a bright light caught her eye. She was puzzled because she just wanted to find that child. It was a sign of friendship given in an abandoned house. That day, the boy saved her from a bag that could have crushed her. He was her little hope for salvation and future life. Unfortunately, she didn't know his name or what he looked like. She started looking for him to thank him. She thought for a moment, for she knew the boy was too young to be a servant. She thought he was most likely one of the young masters. She knew that he was the heir. Archibald was always busy with his lessons. Ironia knew that Edith was always watching Rodon. She never let him out of her sight. She knew that there was only one young man left who could save her then. The young maids whispered to each other because they saw that the young gentleman was sitting in the greenhouse again. They knew that he was waiting again. Madame? They said that it was very sad that Madame Henrietta could not come. They knew that at this time she should see the guests. The young master was furious as he could hear their quiet voices clearly. With the speed of lightning, the young gentleman entered the room and shouted to his mother that the flowers in the greenhouse had blossomed. He told her with a beaming smile that the greenhouse was especially beautiful at this time of year. Madame, in turn, did not pay any attention to him and continued getting ready. The lady looked sideways at her son and said that she was busy now. She asked if he could come to see her later. A moment later, he sat up because he heard someone's footsteps. He thought it was his mother. He looked at the maid with fury and shouted at her to go away, as he would be having tea with his mother in the greenhouse. He was angry and just shouted at her to go away. The young lady stared at the young gentleman. She wasn't sure if it was him or not, as she thought his hair seemed to be a different color. She knew he was young, and the gentleman was too angry and harsh to save her. She looked closely at the young gentleman and wondered how he could be so rude. She came closer to him and asked if he had been crying by chance. Otis was taken aback as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He pushed her away from him in anger and asked her what nonsense she was talking about. She said he shouted that she was just an arrogant servant. He looked at her with fury and anger and asked who she was to sympathize with him. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he didn't like it when someone worried about him. He looked at the maid with anger and said that she also thought that his mother had abandoned him. She looked at him intently and said that if he thought that she sympathized with him, then he was very much mistaken. Sympathy is concern for someone's misfortune. She looked at him intently and asked who was in a more pitiful situation. Irene said that he lived in a beautiful mansion. Although he looked unhappy, Otis asked with fury if she was really making fun of him now. She looked closely at the young gentleman and, quietly taking his hand, said that when you see a man in the rain without an umbrella, you worry about him catching a cold, smiled, and said that for this reason, when he is upset, it would be strange not to worry. She knew that worry was worrying about someone less fortunate. The young master was very embarrassed by her words. She looked at him intently and asked with a soft smile if he agreed with her. He pulled away from her in embarrassment and told her that she should leave him alone and that she was free to do whatever she wanted. Irene looked at him with a smile and said that she was having a very nice day. She asked if he was really going to just lie there. He sighed heavily as she climbed towards him again. She smiled, looking at the young gentleman, and said that the flowers had bloomed very beautifully. She said that the greenhouse was simply wonderful, but unfortunately, there was no one to appreciate it. She sighed heavily and said that it was very sad. The young lady said with a smile that she would sit there for a while and enjoy the picnic. She looked at him intently and said that he could join her if he wanted. The young gentleman looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to hear anything like that. A moment later, like an offended cat, he said that he would not do it. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he did not want to. She said that she had brought the lemon pie and that the best chef in the house had made them. She smiled and said that they were very tasty and sweet. The young gentleman looked at her sideways and said that he didn't like them, but she didn't listen to him and continued to eat with gusto. He turned away from her and said that he didn't love them at all. She looked at him intently with a playful smile, and she knew that it was not true because all children love sweets. She understood perfectly well that he would not be able to resist something like that. Irene looked at the young gentleman with a smile and asked if he wanted one cookie. He shouted and said that he didn't need it. He shouted that he didn't want to eat from her dirty hands. She looked closely at the young gentleman as she recognized his character. She smiled and said that it could be easily remedied. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not understand what she was doing. Irene, wiping her hands after she washed them, said that she did not bring plates and forks. She looked intently at the young gentleman and, handing him a cookie, said that he would have to eat from her hand. Otis froze in place from shock and embarrassment. He could not utter a word. A moment later, he clenched his teeth and shouted that he didn't need this at all. He quickly stood up and pushed the young lady away and shouted that he didn't need this at all. With the speed of lightning, he ran away from her. Irene was in shock. She didn't understand why he behaved like this. She shouted for him to stop. The young gentleman was shocked by her behavior. He did not understand why she acted this way. He was very embarrassed because he knew that she simply offered him a cake. He was puzzled and did not understand at all why his heart suddenly started beating so hard. Archibald looked at his brother and called him, but he was in his thoughts and did not hear him. A moment later, he came up to him and shouted, calling him again. Archibald looked at his brother with concern and said with puzzlement that he had not even noticed that he had cut himself. He asked his brother what he was thinking about. Otis was taken aback and looked at her hands in surprise. Now he realized that he had cut himself pretty badly while making flowers for the young lady. Archibald looked at his brother and said that the doctor had told him that the young lady would be fine, so he need not worry too much about her. Otis sighed heavily and said that he would hope so. He looked closely at the young lady. The young people looked at Archibald and asked what he wanted to tell them. Archibald sighed heavily and said that he had read his stepmother's letter. He looked at his brothers closely and said that the grace period for inheriting the title of head of the family was coming to an end. He asked his brother if he knew about it. He said that there were a few months left. Ever since the influential mothers of Laurenti were sent to Lichfen, they have stopped looking warmly at their sons. Those women tried to subjugate them until the grace period ended, and they would not stand for the price. Otis sighed heavily and said that now he understood why his aunt had decided to visit the estate. So suddenly, Rodon said with a sneer that the raccoon seemed to be nervous. Archibald sighed heavily and said timidly that the stepmother said that they should get married. Otis froze in shock. He didn't expect to hear that. The young people jumped off their chairs and, looking at their brother excitedly, asked what he was talking about. Rodon was taken aback and, looking at his brother, asked if he had really heard correctly. Otis looked at them intently and said that there was nothing to think about. He knew that the woman was up to something. He told him that he could just refuse. Archibald sighed heavily and said that he would like to do it, but they should look at the letter. She wrote that she was very worried that her grown sons had no one. She wrote that now was a very good time, and Archibald would be the first. She wrote that she would send a good artist to paint a portrait. The young people froze in shock. They had not expected anything like this at all. Archibald sighed heavily and said that rumors of an engagement were already circulating, so they needed a good reason to refuse. He looked at his brothers and said that now he would pretend to agree with her. Rodon looked at his brother in surprise and asked if he really agreed to this and was seriously saying all this now. Archibald sighed heavily and said that they needed to find out if there was a scam here. Rodon asked what would happen if they really got married. He shouted that he didn't want that. Archibald looked at them intently and said with a smirk that the first thing they needed to know was whether she would have to pay for touching him. Otis said with a grin that now he didn't have to go to Lichfield alone. Archibald looked closely at his brothers and said with a smile that he had already made a start, and from now on they should act on their own. Otis said that they would leave as soon as they were ready. Otis looked after them and said that they could say hello to their mother. Rodon smiled and told his brother not to worry about anything. They slowly left the room, and the young gentleman was left alone with the lady. He slowly approached her and asked why she was pretending to be asleep. A moment later, the young lady opened her eyes and looked at him in surprise. She asked if he knew about it. She was puzzled and did not understand why he stayed. She looked closely at the young gentleman, as she knew that there must have been two others left. She wondered if he wanted to talk to her again. Irene knew perfectly well that if she continued in the same spirit, an unhappy end awaited them all. She was puzzled because she didn't want to see this anymore. She knew she had to find the spy quickly before things got too bad. She wondered if she should talk to the young master. She knew that later, if the variable arose again, she would be back to the beginning. She knew that of course she could start all over again. Otis looked at the young lady with excitement and called her name. Irene looked away from Otis and called him, sighing heavily. Irene sighed heavily and asked for forgiveness, saying that she needed to leave. Otis was in shock. He said that she couldn't leave in such a state. Irene accidentally slipped and fell on the bed. She involuntarily made a long sound. Otis looked at the lady excitedly and called her. Otis looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was okay. He looked at her closely and said excitedly that she had not recovered yet. The young lady was a little excited as he was too close to her. Otis looked at the lady and said that she shouldn't overdo it. Irene sighed heavily and said that she was fine. She was a little taken aback, as she had not expected such an approach from him. A moment later, he placed a beautiful flower into her palm with a smile. She looked closely at the flower, as she knew it was one of those that Otis often folded. He looked intently at the young lady and said that he had made this rose especially for her. Otis sighed heavily and said that when she lost consciousness, he was overcome with anxiety. She glanced sideways at the ground and noticed that there were several more of his handicrafts on the floor. A moment later, he came closer to her and called her. She was taken aback, as she did not know what he wanted to say. He gently took her hand and asked without looking into her eyes if she remembered their first meeting. He sighed heavily and said that he was young then and very cruel to her. Otis looked deep into her eyes and said that now, looking back, he wondered if she had been honest in her treatment of him. The young lady froze looking at him. He looked at her intently and with a soft smile said that is why, from that day until now, she stood frozen in anticipation of what he would tell her. Otis didn't have time to finish speaking when suddenly from behind the door, one of the brothers shouted at him to come quickly to them. The young man sighed heavily and without raising his eyes said that they would finish talking later. He looked at her intently and with his soft smile said that he really wanted to hear her answer. The young lady in turn froze in surprise on the spot. She did not understand what was being discussed. Veronica sighed heavily. She knew that this was the price in the struggle for power. She knew that if her brother had lived a little longer in Lichfield, it would have been the Trinity, not her. She was furious. She knew that the Knox should be hers. The young lady looked intently at Mrs. Veronica, however, and told her to hold on. She looked at her closely and said that they were still young and childish. Charlotte was Henrietta's niece and Archibald's intended bride. Charlotte looked closely at the lady and said that she was saddened more than anyone by the fate of Laurenti. She said that they should appreciate it. Veronica sighed heavily and told Charlotte that she knew how to support in time. She said with a grin that they would soon admit their mistakes. She would be quiet now. She would endure this, and then she would rejoice. A moment later, they were taken aback as the carriage hit a rock and they started shaking. Veronica was in shock and did not understand what was happening. She quickly got out of the carriage and asked what happened. She did not understand why they stopped. Rodon looked at Veronica with a grin and said that the coachman had disappeared and that the carriage had stopped. Veronica was furious. She didn't understand what was happening. She screamed and called Rodon, but he only looked at her with a grin. He looked at her hard and said that they could let the old raccoon turn the whole house upside down and leave. She looked at him with fury and asked how dare he call her that way. He sighed heavily and said with a smirk that he could say that he smiled and said that there was nothing from his older brother here. He looked at her intently and said that he would not believe that the wheel, which was fine, suddenly broke and came off. Veronica looked at him with fury. She was very angry. Rodon looked at her intently and said that she was now consigliere, but it was temporary. He looked at her intently and asked with a grin who his brother would put in place when he came to power. Veronica looked at him with fury and said that if it weren't for his brothers, he would have been kicked out long ago. She looked at him with fury and, taking out a pistol, said that she had to correct his insolent habits. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she would really shoot him with that object. He said mockingly that he was very scared. She said with a smirk that he was just a fool. Madame slowly snapped her fingers. She looked at him with a smirk and asked if he really thought she was also walking around unaccompanied. A moment later, he was surrounded. Veronica looked at him with a smirk and said that the 7th district was her territory. She looked at him intently and said that no matter what he did, he would not be able to get out. He looked at Veronica with a fierce grin and said that she took the words right out of his mouth. A moment later, he used his magic and began attacking everyone present. Veronica was in shock. She screamed that this question could not be, since she knew that this power was sealed. She looked at him with fury because she understood that he could defeat her. She was shocked because she realized that he had deceived them with the power of Lavrenti. Charlotte sat quietly in the carriage. She was confused and shaking all over. She did not understand what was happening at all. She was very scared. She was in shock and really hoped that someone would save her. A moment later, she heard someone's voice. The young man looked at her intently and asked if she would stop hiding already. He wanted to know if she would get out of the carriage. He looked at her intently and asked if she couldn't hear him. The young lady in turn became very scared and screamed, asking for someone to save her. He looked at her intently and said that he would not kill her and that she could go out with confidence. The young lady in turn froze with tears in her eyes. She was struck by the beauty of the young man. He gave her his hand, and she slowly got out of the carriage. She froze in surprise as she saw that he had knocked out all the bodyguards. She looked closely at the young man as she was amazed that he had dealt with everything on his own. He looked at the young lady intently and said that she should take her aunt and return to Lichfield together. She was surprised and asked him if they would return without protection. He glanced at her casually and said that the locals would help them if anything happened. He sighed heavily and said it was time for him to go back. The young lady was taken aback and shouted at him to stop. She asked if he would really leave her alone in such a place. As he was leaving, he said that she simply should not allow such things to happen in the future. The young lady was in shock. She did not expect him to just leave. She quietly whispered his name, looking after him. The young lady woke up. She was puzzled, as she had not noticed how she had fallen asleep. The young man looked at her intently and said that it seemed she was no longer sleeping. She looked at him in surprise and was taken aback, as she did not understand who was in front of her now. A moment later, she saw the older gentleman in front of her, all his beauty. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that his brother had reported that she had briefly woken up after they had left. He smiled and said that if he had known about it earlier, he would have stayed longer. She looked at him intently and said that she fell asleep again anyway. The young lady was taken aback as she smelled a wonderful fragrance. Turning around, she saw beautiful roses. Archibald looked at her closely and said with a smile that he remembered that she loved roses very much, and in the presence of favorite things, they say one gets better, faster. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she really had to get up. She smiled and apologized for making them all worry. Irene, with a soft smile, said that she was fine. Archibald looked at her closely and said that he heard that from her all the time. He leaned closer to her and said with a smile that now he would not believe it. He said that she should quickly go back to bed. The young gentleman slowly covered her with a warm blanket. She looked at him intently as she understood that this was the first time since she had been treated like this in the game. Irene knew perfectly well that she was a simple servant. She thought for a moment and wondered if this was all for the sake of preventing her resignation. She knew that there was no point in leaving the mansion now. Turning away from the young gentleman, she sighed heavily and said that she would leave anyway, no matter how well they courted her. Archibald looked at her intently and said that he was very sorry that everything turned out this way. He stroked her face tenderly and said that he would tell her again that she was his person. She froze in place after he told her such a thing. He looked at her closely and said that it was only natural to care for her. She knew that Archibald's warm words weakened her. She thought that most likely she might be a little late. He looked at the young lady with warmth. Louise walked slowly into the room. She was puzzled because she knew that trouble had come unexpectedly for them today. She knew that the young lady was already asleep. She quietly entered the room so as not to wake the young lady. She sighed heavily because she knew that this was all she could do for her. She thought for a moment as she hoped that Irene would recover soon. Irene looked closely at the young lady and asked how much longer she was going to sneak up on her at night. Louise shuddered as she did not expect the lady to wake up. Louise looked at the lady with a smile and asked if she had not been sleeping. She sighed heavily and told Louise that she could no longer deprive her of her dinner. Louise was shocked. She did not understand how the lady knew that it was her dinner. The young lady in turn knew that Louise worked at the estate to pay off her debt, and she could not buy food with her own money. She was puzzled and did not understand why the girl was so kind to her. She looked closely at Louise and asked if she was tired. Louise looked at the lady in bewilderment as she did not understand what she was talking about. Irene was very excited. She asked Louise again if she was tired. She knew that Louise had been working instead of her, and she was very hungry. She didn't understand why Louise was acting this way. Louise in turn looked intently at Irene, with a soft smile on her face. Louise looked at the young lady closely and said with a smile that she liked her very much, so she hoped that she would get better soon and that everything would be fine with her. The young lady in turn was deeply upset. She knew Louise was simply mistaken about her. She didn't deserve such kindness from her. She sighed heavily because she knew that Louise knew nothing about her, and she had no idea how many days of happiness she had put Louise through. At first, she also really liked Louise, and in the soulless estate, she became a real friend to her. But in order to return to the real world, she brought Louise to the appointed tragedy many times. Unfortunately, in the process, she killed her 3 times. For this reason, she promised herself never to get close to Louise again. She was a little puzzled and didn't understand how things had come to this. Louise said with a smile that the setting reminded her of a slumber party. She smiled and said that they often had such parties when they were children. Irene sighed heavily and said that she was right. Louise looked closely at the young lady and said that she seemed like a very caring person. Irene sighed and told Louise that she was exaggerating. Louise quickly sat up on the bed and said that it was not so, since she was indebted to her every day. She told the young lady that she had helped her a lot. Irene sighed heavily since she knew that it was the pure truth. Louise looked closely at the young lady and asked if she really wanted to leave the mansion. Louise smiled shyly and said that she would most likely work in the mansion for the rest of her life. She looked closely at the young lady and said that, frankly, speaking after her father's business failed, she was left with a lot of debt. Irene, in turn, sighed heavily since she knew everything. She knew that this plot was just a setup. Louise's father committed suicide, thereby leaving her with huge debts. Unfortunately, she could not refuse a highly paid job in the mansion because of this. Louise looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she would like to confess honestly. She smiled timidly and said that at first she thought it would be good if Irene stayed here next to her. Irene hesitated, not knowing what to answer. Louise looked intently at the young lady and said that it was because she realized that she wanted her happiness even more. Irene froze in surprise on the spot. She did not expect anything like this. Louise looked at her closely and said with a smile that she had treated the stranger very warmly at their first meeting. As Louise fell asleep, she said that the young lady seemed cold to her, but in fact she was a very kind person. Irene looked intently at the young lady and slowly covered her with a warm blanket. She sighed heavily because she knew that even if the story continued to go around in circles, she would really like Louise to be truly happy in this life. Rodon looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that he brought her a pet, just in case she got very bored. Irene, in turn, was taken aback. She did not expect to see anything like that. She timidly said that he was very handsome. She sighed heavily as she was puzzled by the fact that this was not a room for a sick person, but a thoroughfare. She knew that, at this rate, it would be better for her if she returned to work. Rodon smiled and said that, while Pet was here, no one would be able to approach her except him. He looked closely at the young lady, and with a beaming smile, said that she should praise him. The lady froze in surprise. She looked intently into his eyes, because she knew that something had changed very much in him. She looked at him in surprise and wondered if he had used Elios. Elios, a magical relic that supposedly no longer existed. It was left with the brothers after the previous head of the Lavrenti family. The relic contained incredible power, but no one had been able to control it before. Until the brilliant alchemist Edith Laurenti used her innate talent. She granted her son the ability to use Elios. Along with the enormous power, he received something else. She looked closely at the young master and invited him to sit down for a bit. He looked at the young lady intently and said that he felt a little sorry, as if he had been stabbed. Then he could have been with her here and now. She sighed heavily and told him not to say such things to her. She looked closely at the young master as he surprised her with his unusually bold actions and frank words. She saw a surge of his emotion. She knew that, unfortunately, all of these were side effects of possessing the relic. The young lady looked at the young gentleman in surprise as he suddenly hugged her. He looked closely at the young lady and said quietly that he very much hoped she would return soon. She looked at him with a tender smile and hugged him back tightly. A moment later, the young lady asked how Louise was doing. He was taken aback, as he had not expected to hear such a question. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she suddenly remembered that Maid Irene looked at the young master and said that the maid was doing the work that they should do together, so she was very worried about her. Rodon sighed heavily and said that he had caught a glimpse of her work a couple of times. Unfortunately, something was always happening to her. The young lady sighed heavily, as she was not even surprised. She sighed heavily, as all this worried her very much. Rodon looked closely at the young lady and said excitedly that since they were talking about Louise, he thought she was hiding something from them. Irene was taken aback and froze in place. She was a little surprised by such a statement. Irene, after some time she started working. She froze in surprise on the spot when a towel fell on her. Louise was shocked. She quickly apologized to the young lady. Louise said that she had stumbled, and that was the reason why everything had turned out this way. She asked her for forgiveness for a while. Irene sighed heavily, because she knew that Louise was a bad worker. Irene knew that although Louise was a little clumsy, it had not caused her any problems so far. Rodon, in turn, knew that Louise was hiding something from them, because on the day of his aunt's arrival, he went out of the room with her to see what was happening. He was taken aback when the incense commotion started. He was a little surprised, because Louise continued to tend to his wounds, as if nothing had happened, and she was not even surprised by the sound of the shot. But when the young lady fainted, Louise almost fell into a terrible panic. He thought for a moment, as it all seemed very strange to him. The young lady, in turn, looked closely at Louise, as she understood that this was really strange. She knew that Louise had been in a similar state when practically the same thing had happened to Rodon. She looked closely at Louise, knowing that they had only recently met, but she was already reacting like this. Irene thought that her strange behavior could be caused by a system error. Irene looked closely at the young lady. She knew she needed to keep an eye on Louise. Louise looked sideways at the lady with a smile and said that she had been falling suspiciously often lately. She sighed heavily and said that this did not usually happen. Irene looked at her intently and asked if she was sure that it was only lately that she was falling. Walking slowly up the stairs, she smiled and said that she was sure of it, but a moment later, Louise stumbled and began to fall down the stairs. Irene was in shock. She screamed and called the girl. Irene, in turn, easily managed to catch Louise. They froze for a moment, looking at each other. Irene looked at the young lady intently and said that she almost fell down the stairs. Louise froze for a moment as the young lady addressed her as a friend. Irene looked at the young lady with concern and asked if she was okay. She was very worried that Louise might have hurt her ankle. Louise looked away from the lady and said that she was perfectly fine. A moment later, she screamed and was taken aback. Irene looked at Louise in surprise, as she did not understand why she was behaving this way. Louise was shocked. She was taken aback and quickly sat down on the ground. She asked the young lady for forgiveness, since it was her fault that all the bed linen was scattered on the ground. She sighed heavily and said that she would quickly wash everything. Irene looked at Louise in surprise, but did not answer. Louise shouted that she would not cause her any trouble and would do everything herself. The young lady sighed heavily and said with a soft smile that they could do it together. She looked closely at Louise and said with a smile that the main thing was that she had not injured her leg and everything else could be fixed. Louise froze in shock and embarrassment. She was pleased to hear something like that. Irene looked at the girl and said that they could go back before it was too late and redo everything. Irene sighed heavily, as she was very tired. She had been watching Louise all day, but had not noticed anything. She was puzzled, and knew that it was best to resolve the spy issue quickly, as the next episode was about to begin. There was one dark episode called The Portrait Covered in Blood. Unfortunately, Veronica did not like Henrietta's plan for Archibald and Charlotte to marry. With the help of a spy, she bribes an artist sent by Henrietta and orders the murder of Archibald. However, everything does not go according to plan, and the murder is thwarted, leaving the portrait unfinished. It was said that it was soaked in the artist's blood. She knew that if Veronica had already sent a spy into their house, then most likely he would go to the artist directly. The young lady knew that she needed to find him before the latter arrived. She slowly entered the room and looked closely at all the objects that interested her. She had prepared all the materials in advance, in particular, a luminous dye that can only be seen by a person using special eye drops. She knew that if she applied it to the artist's tool, it would be easy to recognize the spy when they met. She knew that because of the side effects, she would not be able to use the drops multiple times, but their price was very high. Archibald looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was still getting ready. She was taken aback, as she did not expect to see an older gentleman. He looked at her closely and asked if she was feeling better. Irene came closer to the young gentleman and said that the doctor kept asking her about it, but she was fine. He looked at the young lady with concern and said that there could be consequences. She looked at him intently, but said nothing. He smiled and asked if she could help him a little. He looked at her with a gentle smile and said that she always did this, and unfortunately, it was not easy for one to cope with something like this. The young lady looked at him with a smile and said that he was simply not used to this. She slowly buttoned his sleeve. Irene looked closely at the young gentleman. She saw that he was dressed in a suit, a three-piece suit and a tie, a scarf and cufflinks gold jewelry, with a ruby and an eagle coat of arms. She knew that everything he was wearing was chosen by her personally. It seemed to her that he was precisely decorated, but even without that a perfect sculpture. She understood perfectly well that anyone would be worried and would not be able to decide on clothes for a meeting with a future wife whom he had never seen. Unfortunately, she was not in the mood. She looked closely at the young gentleman and said that now everything was ready. He sighed heavily and said that it was very funny he was getting ready to marry a stranger. He looked at her with a smile and said that there was nothing that would not pass through her hands. She looked closely at the young master and said that he did not need to worry as he was magnificent. She looked at him with a bright smile and said that whoever his betrothed was, she would like him no matter what. He looked at the young lady in surprise and asked why she thought so. She looked at him in surprise because she knew that everything was obvious. She looked intently at the young gentleman and said that he was very handsome, well-built. Archibald froze in surprise and asked what she was talking about. A moment later, he laughed wildly, and Archibald said with a smile that he had not expected her to think that way about him. Irene looked at him intently and said that she was speaking seriously now. She said that such an ideal person as he could not be found. She looked at him intently because she was glad that he was now relaxed. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that he should keep this attitude. Irene looked at him with a soft smile and said that he was a very good person. She looked at him intently and said that he would definitely be loved. Archibald, in turn, froze in place in surprise. He did not expect to hear such a thing. In turn, Archibald still remembered the girl he had looked at when he was younger. He remembered her youthful face and flowing hair. At that time, he simply could not take his gaze off her, as she always shone with radiant beauty. Unlike the foolish brothers, he, the heir to the family, was busy with his lessons. He could only watch as she played with his stepbrothers. He saw that she was happy because she was spending time with them. Archibald sighed heavily, as he also wanted to do origami with her. The young lady, in turn, looked back as she felt someone's gaze on her. Otis looked at the maid in surprise and asked why she was acting like this. She sighed heavily and said that she simply felt someone's gaze on her. He looked at the young lady and said that there was no one there. She sighed heavily and said that she seemed to have imagined it. Archibald was very puzzled and embarrassed as he almost got caught. At that moment, he felt it for the first time. After that incident, he could no longer take his gaze off her, even when she helped his brother make friends with animals. Even when Otis began to show talent with weapons. Knowing that he didn't need a tutor, like the young lady, he kept his eyes on her. He felt very warm, and at the same time it hurt. He thought that, most likely, this was just a whim on his part. Archibald looked closely at the young lady and asked if she believed him. Irene looked at the young gentleman with a soft smile and said that of course she believed him. He sighed heavily and looked closely at the lady. Since she really didn't know anything, he really wanted her to trust him. He wanted her to trust him more than others. Archibald came closer to the young lady and took her hand. She froze in surprise. He looked at her intently and asked why she didn't say then that there was a spy in the house. Irene froze in shock. She didn't know what to answer. He looked at her intently and said that she had mentioned him when she was recovering from the fainting. He looked at her intently and said that she should not remain silent. The young lady was taken aback. She didn't know what to answer. She sighed heavily and realized that she shouldn't have even mentioned spies. She thought that it was all in vain that she did something like that. Archibald looked at her closely and said that he was very glad to hear that she trusted him. He asked if she hadn't been able to trust him before. The young lady, in turn, was a little puzzled. She said that the department was not in charge of this. A moment later, they were informed that a guest had arrived at the estate. The young lady, in turn, ran away without asking herself whether an artist had come to see them. She knew what she had to do. She quickly walked to the door and told the young master that she would bring him. Archibald, in turn, looked furiously after the young lady, but did not answer. Irene was in a hurry to meet the guest. She was a little worried because seeing Archibald's reaction, she was worried about him because it seemed to her that someone had hurt him. She wanted to leave only good memories before leaving the house. The young man looked at her sideways and said that she had better hurry. He sighed heavily and said that he was worried to death that the noble lady was being met by Louise. The young lady, in turn, was living in opium because she did not understand who was being talked about. She looked at the young man in surprise and asked if it was really the artist who had come to their estate. She was excited and asked who he was talking about. The young man sighed heavily and said that it was not the artist. He said that Miss Charlotte had come to visit them at the estate. Charlotte looked closely at Louise and asked what her relationship was with Rodon. Louise froze in surprise. She did not expect to hear such a question. She looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She did not understand what kind of relationship she was talking about. Charlotte, slowly sipping her tea, told the maid to answer honestly, as she just wanted to know the truth. Louise looked at the young lady in bewilderment and said that he was the employer and she was his employee. Charlotte, in turn, screamed furiously that it was not funny at all, and she heard what they were talking about. She hurriedly headed to the place where she was told to go. Charlotte had her own plan. She wanted to get lost in the garden, and then the young master would take her to the tea ceremony. A moment later, she noticed the young gentleman. She was very happy, but noticed that he was not alone. She heard him say that they even slept in the same bed. After what he said, she froze in shock on the spot. She was shocked and did not understand if this was true. She looked intently at the young master and at the maid who was smiling radiantly at him. Charlotte furiously told Louise that she heard that Louise slept with Rodon. Louise was shocked. She screamed that this did not happen, and she was talking about another maid. Charlotte rose from her chair in anger and asked Louise if she really thought that she was going to tolerate all her lies. Now, she shouted at Louise that she seemed to despise her too. Louise told the lady that she was not lying and was telling the truth. Charlotte angrily hit the young maid in the face. Charlotte looked at the maid with fury and shouted that she was simply disgusting. She shouted that as soon as she became Laurenti, she would immediately deal with Louise. A moment later, Irene entered the room. Irene looked at everyone present with fury and asked what was going on. Louise, the son, looked at Miss with a radiant smile. She was very glad to see her. She quickly approached Louise and asked what had happened to her and how she was feeling. She told Louise to go to her room, and she would take care of the guest herself. Louise looked at her in surprise. She knew that it was her responsibility. Irene looked at the young lady intently and said that she was not just sending her away, as she had a request. A moment later, she leaned over quietly and whispered something in her ear. Louise, in turn, ran off in a hurry to carry out her orders. Charlotte angrily shouted at the maid to stay put as she had not finished speaking. Charlotte was furious and did not understand how they dared. Irene looked intently at the young lady and said that she had come to them without an invitation and would kill their servants. She herself looked at Charlotte with anger and said that it was too much of her. Charlotte looked at the maid with anger and asked who she was to teach her. Irene bowed and asked forgiveness for the late introduction. She said that she was the senior servant. She looked at the young lady with fury and asked permission to take care of her. Louise ran to the young gentleman in a hurry. She was in a great hurry and did not call him while he was playing with the cat. He looked at her in surprise and said that at this rate she could suffocate. He did not understand what had happened. She ran closer to him and was breathing heavily, looked at him intently. He looked at her in surprise as he noticed that her face was injured. He asked excitedly what was wrong with her face. Louise screamed that it was not important at all now. She looked at the young gentleman excitedly and said that the miss asked her to give him something. He was glad when he heard the name Irene. She looked at him intently and said, "The young lady said she needed a hound." He froze in shock. Louise looked at the young gentleman with surprise and excitement. She did not understand why the lady needed a hound. She looked after the young gentleman and asked if she really wanted to intimidate Charlotte. As he left, he looked at Louise and asked where the young lady was now. Charlotte Eunice, an attractive and charming young lady. Unfortunately, due to ambitious but misguided aspirations, she became one of the chess pieces. Every time Charlotte came to the mansion, she intimidated Louise. She tried to get closer to her unrequited love, Rodon. Irene, in turn, tried not to interfere in the story, but when she saw Louise, she realized that she had to intervene. Hearing Charlotte's words, she was unconscious, served all together, as she realized that Charlotte simply misunderstood Louise's words. Charlotte was furious. She shouted that the young man was not the kind of person who would have fun with a simple servant. She shouted that he was strong and incomparable. Irene looked closely at the young lady and said that the maid slept with her in the same room yesterday, and she was like a younger sister to her. She looked intently at the young lady and shouted that she was engaged not to Rodon, but to Archabald. Charlotte froze in surprise. She could not utter a word. She turned her gaze away from the maid. Irene looked at the young lady and asked her not to forget this fact. She looked at Charlotte intently and said that since she had damaged the dignity of their house with her misunderstanding, she should apologize to the maid. Charlotte was shocked and did not expect to hear such a thing. She said that no master would like their servant to be hit in the face. Charlotte said that they would not be very angry with her, since the mistress of this house was her aunt. Irene looked intently at Charlotte and asked if she really meant Henrietta. Irene sighed heavily and said, "Young lady," that she swung at the maid. She looked at Charlotte intently and said that Henrietta had done the same thing for which she was sent out of the house. She said that they often exchanged letters. Charlotte froze in shock. She remembered Henrietta saying that she was betting everything on her. Then she asked Charlotte if she knew how much it meant. Henrietta told Charlotte not to disappoint her. Charlotte was in shock. She screamed that this simply couldn't be happening. In a hurry, she screamed that Irene must quickly bring her back, and she would apologize to her. She screamed that Henrietta did not need to know about this under any circumstances. The young lady looked at Charlotte intently and told her to calm down immediately. She said that she would definitely make sure that this did not happen. She told Charlotte that it was time for her to leave before Rodon arrived. As he walked towards the young lady, he replayed her words about needing a hound. To explain this fact, he could go back a few years to when she became Otis and Rodon's tutor. All the servants in the house whispered quietly. They did not understand why the lady was always treated in a special way. They did not understand why the young gentleman loved her so much. Irene was a little puzzled as she realized that she was hated because she began to educate the young masters. Blinded by hatred, the servant stole her opal button. She had to endure the bullying of her working-class peers. She was puzzled as she had already lived on the estate for several decades, but she knew that it was still very difficult for her with their children. Even if she decided to fight them back, she knew that, unfortunately, no one would take her side. Irene sighed heavily and, looking at her hands, realized that they were wounded. She knew that she had to wake up young Master Rodon already. The young lady, in turn, took her gloves and slowly walked towards the young gentleman. As she led him into the room, she looked at him intently and informed him of her arrival. She slowly walked closer to him and told him that he should wake up. She sighed because she saw that he was still sleeping. She slowly walked closer to him and saw that he was sleeping quietly and peacefully in a sweet sleep. She stared at the young master for a while, for when he slept, he looked like a real angel. She thought he was very cute. Irene sighed heavily and took his hand. She was glad that she quickly put on her gloves. She knew that she had to wait a few minutes as usual. She knew that after this, he would slowly wake up. She sighed heavily, since the young master put the servants in a difficult situation every morning. But as soon as she took his hand, sleep began to recede. Young gentleman, you in turn felt the warm hands of the young lady. He felt warm and wet hands. For a moment he froze, and was taken aback, as this had never happened before. The young lady looked at him with a smile and greeted him early in the morning. He was taken aback and looked closely at her hands. He was in shock. He excitedly asked where she got the blood on her hands. He was shocked. He asked if she was really wounded. The young lady hesitated, not knowing what to answer. She looked at the young gentleman intently and asked for forgiveness, as the gloves were causing him discomfort. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. He shouted that it was not important at all. He looked at the young lady intently and said that when she was in pain, he should take care of her. She froze in surprise for a moment, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. Rodon looked closely at the young lady and asked who had tormented her. She smiled a soft smile and said that no one had tormented her. She looked at the young master and said that she had just fallen and that she would be careful from now on. He sighed heavily, as he knew perfectly well that she was lying to him now. The young gentleman looked at the lady intently, took her hand, and asked if she had ever been to a hunting ground. She thought for a moment and immediately replied that she had never been there. He said that hunters always bring their hounds there. The hounds brought messenger birds, protected their masters, and also tracked down prey. Rodon looked at her, and with a radiant smile said that he would become her hound. Irene froze for a moment in surprise. She laughed because she realized that he would be her protector after his words. Her soul felt better. She knew that this was very similar to him. She thanked him with a smile for his kind words. Rodon looked intently at the young ladies as soon as he entered. The young lady, in turn, looked intently at Rodon, since he knew what her words meant. Charlotte rushed towards Rodon with a radiant smile. She looked at him intently and thanked him for the fact that she was now safe. Rodon looked at her with bewilderment because he did not understand what she was talking about. He looked at the young lady in surprise and asked who she was. Charlotte froze in shock. She didn't know how to react to this. He looked at the young lady with fury and contempt and told her to get out of his way immediately. He told her that she was simply annoying him. Irene sighed heavily and told the young gentleman that this was Master Archibald's betrothed, Miss Charlotte. He looked at the young lady in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked closely at his friend and asked if they were expecting guests. Charlotte was taken aback and with a timid smile said that she had simply come to see the young man. He looked at her intently and, squeezing her shoulder, said that whoever she was, his brother was very busy, and it was unwise to come to him without warning. He looked at her furiously and asked if she didn't find this very impolite. She froze for a moment as his aura pressed on her. She turned over in her head his words about what he had said. He looked at her closely and said that he was a little disappointed, as the future mistress was acting very selfishly. She asked for forgiveness and quickly flew to the door. The young gentleman looked after her intently, as he had seen her somewhere, but unfortunately he could not remember where he had seen her. The young lady looked at the young gentleman intently and thanked him. He looked at her in surprise and said that he thought she was in danger, but asked if that was all. Irene looked at the gentleman intently and said that Charlotte had misunderstood another maid, which had caused a big problem. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Irene looked intently at the young gentleman and said that as far as she knew, she had heard that he and Louise had shared a bed. Rodon froze in shock. He had not expected to hear anything like that at all. A moment later, he was taken aback and excitedly asked if he had really shared a bed with that lump of rabbit fur. She looked at him in surprise and asked if that was not true. Rodon shouted that, of course it was not true. Irene looked intently at the young gentleman and asked where Charlotte could have heard such a thing. Rodon hesitated, not knowing what to answer. He was very embarrassed. She looked intently at him and asked how such a thing could have happened. Louise looked closely at the young gentleman and said with a smile that she liked Irene very much. She said that she was very kind, caring, and really good at everything. She looked intently at the young gentleman and with a radiant smile and sparkling eyes, asked how one could be so perfect. She in turn wondered if she could ever become like her friend. Rodon sighed heavily and said that he did not know this. He was puzzled, since she had already told him all this over and over again for the 100th time. Rodon sighed heavily, and looking at the lady, said that since she had met him, he had only heard about Irene from her. He looked at Louise intently, and said that they seemed to have become very close. Louise smiled, and said that maybe it was just fate. Rodon looked at the young lady with surprise and bewilderment, as he did not understand what she was talking about. He thought for a moment, and wanted to ask her something. Before he could ask her a question, Louise quickly stood up and told the young gentleman that the young lady had helped her very much when she caught her with the ladder when she almost fell. The young gentleman was taken aback and shouted that she had scared him. Louise looked at the young gentleman mockingly and asked if he had never had the same experience. He was furious and shouted that there was nothing to envy. He said that the young lady holds his hand every morning. Louise was taken aback, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She looked at him intently and said that she did not envy him, either because he and the lady had a special relationship. He looked at her in surprise and asked how it was. She looked closely at the young master and said proudly that they even slept together. Rodon sighed heavily, as he could not tell the young lady such a thing. She looked at him intently and asked if he wouldn't tell her what had happened. He sighed heavily and said that nothing had happened. They were just chatting. He looked away from her, embarrassed, and asked if she wanted to praise him. Rodon looked at her intently and said that he had dropped an important matter to come to her. Irene, looking at the young man, noticed that he now looked like a puppy whose toy had been taken away. She looked at the young man with a smile. A moment later, she came closer to him as she wanted to reward him for his help. She looked at him intently, with a smile, told him that he should come closer to her. A moment later, he came to her as she said. She hugged him tightly, and he froze in place with embarrassment. She smiled with a soft smile and said that he was the only one who still fooled her like this. He asked if she really meant to say that he was special. The young lady in turn knew that, of course, he was special to her because Rodon was the only owner of Elios. Instead of granting the bearer great power, Elios made him cruel and greedy. When Rodon, under the influence of force, became so violent that no one could approach him, she, the nanny, had to calm him down. Irene, in turn, never refused to help the young master. She did everything just like Louise did in the previous playthrough. Now it was she who did it, and he fell asleep peacefully in her arms. She sighed heavily, because she knew perfectly well that it was Louise, and not she, who should be interested in Rodon's attacks and console him. She knew that she had to make sure of something. She looked intently at the young gentleman, or said with a soft smile that he was more than just special. Since of all the gentlemen, he was the closest. Rodon was very glad to hear such words. He blossomed before our eyes and asked with a smile if it was true. With tears in his eyes, he asked the young lady how she was going to leave him and their home. She sighed heavily as she saw the abrupt change of topic. He looked intently at the young lady and said that she must definitely stay. He said that he needed her, and he would very much like to live together forever. The young master looked at her intently and asked if she could stay with him. He looked at her intently and said that if she left the mansion, then he would leave it with her. The young lady stopped him and, looking him intently in the eyes, said that he could live well without her. Rodon froze in place after her words. She looked at him intently and said that he would quickly get used to it. He was shocked, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, she turned around and walked away as she said she had to meet the artist. She sighed heavily and said that she would leave him. She knew that she needed to get out of the house quickly before the story dragged on. The young master looked at her intently and shouted at her to stop, but it was all in vain. He was very angry and could not just forget her and let her go so easily. Louise, in turn, sat quietly in the garden and stroked the cat. Rodon slowly approached the young lady and asked what she was doing there. She was taken aback, as she did not expect to see a young gentleman. She looked intently at the young gentleman and said with a smile that she was pinned down by the cats and could not move. He looked at her in surprise and said that she was keeping a good eye on him, not that he sighed heavily and said that in fact he wanted to show it to Irene. She looked at the young gentleman in surprise and asked if Irene really liked cats. He sighed heavily and said that he didn't know. She just said that he was like a black cat. Louise looked at the young gentleman intently and asked in bewilderment if he was not a puppy. He was furious and shouted that she was just a ball of rabbit fur. He shouted that Irene had told him otherwise. She was taken aback and looked at the young gentleman in surprise. She did not understand why she looked like rabbit fur. She screamed and said that he was a ball of dog hair. Rodon asked angrily if he really looked like a cable. She screamed that he shouldn't swear since she was talking about a puppy. She looked at him closely and said that he didn't mind at all when she called him a hound. He thought for a moment about being a faithful hound, a pet who was devoted to his master. Give him the leash so he doesn't go away. These creatures with loving faces cling to others until they can't abandon someone. Then he has the right to do whatever he wants. He sighed heavily because he wanted to stay with the lady forever. Louise looked at the young gentleman in surprise and asked what was wrong with him, as he suddenly became very serious. She did not understand why such a change had suddenly occurred. He looked closely at Louise and said that she liked Irene. Rodon looked at her puzzledly and said that when the contract ended, she would leave. He asked if she could handle it. She sighed heavily and said that since he asked about it, she didn't think she could quite cope. She wanted to stay with the young lady at least for a little while. She looked closely at the young gentleman and said with a smile that she was not greedy at all and wished Miss Happiness. He froze for a moment and dimmed after her words. He in turn will make her happy himself. Louise looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was asleep. Louise sighed heavily as she saw that her question remained unanswered. She was a little puzzled as she wanted to talk to the young lady. Louise wanted to tell the young lady that she was very glad that she could help. Louise looked at the lady and asked what she was looking for. Irene sighed heavily and said that she was looking for a larger container. The container for washing bones was too small. She looked at Louise and said that she could relax there. Louise smiled and asked how. So Louise told the lady that she helped her and saved her, and now she wants to help her in return. Irene looked at Louise intently and asked if she could help her find a suitable jar. Louise, with shining eyes, said that she would find everything for her. A moment later, she said that she would see a container upstairs that looked like the one she needed. Irene saw the container and said that she would get it. Now Louise looked at the young lady with concern and asked her to be careful. Moments later, Louise looked closely at the young lady and called out to her. Louise, with a radiant smile, picked up the young lady and enthusiastically told her to go down, and that she didn't need to worry at all, as she would ensure her. Irene looked at the young lady in surprise, but still thanked her with a smile. Irene smiled a radiant smile and said that she could have fallen, but thanks to Louise, everything worked out. Louise understood perfectly well that as the gentleman had said, she would leave, but before that moment, she wanted to leave more good memories of herself. She sighed heavily as she wanted to help her a little. A moment later, she lay down in bed and decided to stop thinking about such things, as she knew that she had to get up early the next day. She quietly went to bed, but unfortunately, she could not sleep. Her thoughts did not leave her. A few hours earlier, Charlotte had returned to the Lichvan mansion. Veronica looked closely at the young lady and said that it looked like she had returned back. Charlotte looked at Mrs. Veronica in surprise, as she did not expect to see her so quickly. Veronica looked at the lady with a smirk and asked how Laurenti was. Charlotte hesitated, not knowing what to say. A moment later, she timidly said that she was thrown out, saying that a guest would arrive soon. Veronica laughed a fierce laugh. She said that of course it was expected. She looked sharply at Charlotte and asked if she really thought they were such fools as to accept her so immediately. Veronica came closer to the young lady and asked if she knew that an artist from Henrietta would be coming to visit them today. Charlotte froze for a moment, as she knew nothing. She looked at Madame in surprise and asked if they were really expecting the artist to arrive. Veronica sighed heavily and said that it seemed that Henrietta had not told her anything. Veronica looked closely at the young lady, for she knew that Henrietta, by marrying this girl to Archibald, planned to put herself in line. She knew that they were in cahoots. She looked closely at the young lady and thought, she knew that if anyone thought that they would just be left alone, then they were wrong. Veronica, looking at Charlotte, said that she sent her to Laurenti to divert attention from her man while she was kicked here and there. He began to act. Veronica looked at the young lady with a smirk and asked why Henrietta, whom she admired so much, did not tell her anything. The young lady in turn froze in place. She did not know what to answer. Charlotte thought for a moment. She was very confused by everything that was happening. She wondered if she was just bait. Veronica came closer to her and took her by the face, said that she did not see any joy in her eyes at all. The young lady sighed heavily and timidly said that everything was fine, and the main thing was that she was able to help them with something. She was puzzled since they sent her, but they did not see at all how Lavrenti had behaved. She knew perfectly well that there must be a reason why Madame Henrietta had not told her anything. Veronica looked at the young lady with a sneer and said that she was simply poor. She looked at Charlotte with fury and a smirk and said that she should choose wisely who to follow. She quietly whispered in her ear that she had great faith in Henrietta. Veronica said quietly, with a sneer, that it would be very easy for Eunice's family to sell her to another buyer, and she would only have to obey them. Madame looked at Veronica in surprise and asked what she was doing with the girl. Veronica looked at her with a smirk and mockery and asked why she had crawled out of the laboratory. Edith looked intently at Veronica, but did not answer. Charlotte, in turn, froze in place when she saw Mr. Rodon's mother. A moment later, she ran up to her and asked with a smile what brought her here. Edith sighed heavily and said that she had simply gone out because she had run out of coffee. She looked at them intently and asked if they would tell her what they had both been doing there. Veronica looked at her in surprise and asked what was wrong with her. She asked if she really cared about anything other than research. She came closer to the young lady and said that, from what she heard, the lady had been to the Laurenti house. Charlotte stood still for a moment in surprise. She looked closely at the young lady and asked if she had seen her son there. She wanted to know how he was doing there. Veronica looked at him mockingly and asked if she had really decided to take an interest in her son's life. She laughed hysterically and said that Madame had abandoned him. Veronica said that she saw that maternal feelings had not gone anywhere. Veronica was surprised that Edith had come all this way to find out such a trifle. Veronica looked at her closely and asked with a smirk why she didn't stop doing what was out of character for her and continue quietly doing her research. Veronica said that she had something to talk about with Charlotte, so they were busy. Edith looked intently at Veronica and said that she understood her, and when Henrietta returned, she would definitely tell her about their important conversation. Veronica was very angry. She called out angrily, "Madam!" Edith carelessly threw the cup on the ground and asked for forgiveness. She said that Veronica screamed so suddenly that the cup slipped out of her hands in fright. She glanced sideways at Veronica, and as she left, said that this was the reason she didn't leave the lab. She looked at Charlotte and said that the beta was following her. She looked sideways at Veronica and told the young lady that by staying there, she was in great danger of getting hurt. Veronica, in turn, was burning with rage and anger, but she did not say anything to them. Edith looked at Veronica and told her to put everything in order. Here, since she would steal the young lady for a short time, Veronica shouted with fury and told them to stay where they were. Veronica looked at her with fury and asked if she really thought that such behavior would save her. Edith said with a satisfied grin that this was probably true, since she was the only person who could create what she needed. Edith glanced sideways at the young lady and said that she had a little conversation with her. Charlotte hesitated, not knowing what to answer. She looked intently at the young lady and said that she needed a sample for an experiment. Charlotte, in turn, froze in fright on the spot. She did not understand what was being discussed. She looked closely at the young lady and said that for this reason, she was looking for a suitable person. Charlotte trembled with fear and fright. She thought that most likely the rumors about the capture and hiding of people were true. Edith looked at the young lady with a smile and said that it seemed like she had suddenly turned to stone. She asked Charlotte with a smile what was wrong with her. She wanted to know if Charlotte was already afraid that she would cut her open. Charlotte was very worried and cried out that this was not so. Edith looked closely at the young lady and said that she would not be performing an autopsy, but of course she needed to check something. She looked closely at Charlotte and asked with a smile if she really liked someone. Charlotte was taken aback for a moment. Edith looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she could not deny it, since she had recently been diagnosed with love fever. She smiled and said that it was very surprising and that this was the first time she had seen such a thing up close. Edith sighed heavily and said that Charlotte knew what kind of people surrounded her. A moment later, she handed the young lady a small gift. Charlotte looked at the small bottle in surprise and asked what it was. Edith returned and said that it was a small gift called a love potion. The potion affects the nervous system and creates the illusion of being in love. The young lady froze in place in surprise. She stared intently at the love potion. Charlotte looked at Madame in surprise and asked why she was giving it to her. Madame smiled and said that she needed a lover, a test subject, and a sample for taking the potion. She told Charlotte to take it and give it to the person she was in love with. Madame looked closely at the young lady and said that the man would begin to treat her completely differently. Charlotte was surprised, but at the same time very happy. She looked intently at Madame and asked if this potion could really make a person love her. Edith looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she could not say anything about that. She told Charlotte that she was expecting too much from a drug that was only being tested. She told the young lady many other things, but Charlotte did not hear her. She quickly pushed the young lady out the door and told her that the medicine only had a 15-day shelf life, so she must use it within that time. Edith told her nalady that since her business was finished, she could leave. Charlotte was a little puzzled. She shouted at her mistress to wait a bit. The young lady was taken aback when she found herself behind the door. She held the love potion tightly in her hands. She understood perfectly well that with it, she looked like a little child. She knew that the lady had given it to her, and with it, she could be happy. She understood perfectly well that she should not miss this opportunity. The young lady, in turn, walked leisurely along the corridor. She had no intention of hurrying at all. She was puzzled by the fact that Charlotte arrived at the mansion very quickly. She was excited because the story was constantly changing, and she knew that it could not be delayed any longer. She understood perfectly well that she needed to catch the spy. She knew he was in cahoots with the artist, and she had to find him. The other day, she applied some glow-in-the-dark dye to her brush and jars. She prepared eye drops for herself. Irene understood perfectly well that with their help she would be able to follow the artist's path. The young lady slowly put eye drops into her eyes. A moment later, the drop took effect, and she saw everything. She knew that if she just followed the marks, she would find him. The young lady, in turn, slowly followed the marks, and she came out to the greenhouse. She was a little surprised and alarmed. A moment later, she froze in place as she saw that there was someone in the greenhouse. She understood perfectly well that she could not miss him. She was puzzled and worried because she understood perfectly well that if you let him go, he would never know that you were planning a spy. She quickly rushed to the greenhouse, knowing that today she had to reveal him. She wanted to erase the traces of the past. She quickly entered the greenhouse and clearly saw a young man in front of her. She grabbed his hand and shouted for him to stop. The young lady froze in surprise as she saw the young gentleman in front of her. The young lady looked at the young gentleman in surprise. She did not expect to see him in the greenhouse at all. She looked at him intently and asked what he was doing here. Otis was taken aback. He didn't know what to answer. He looked at her in surprise and said that it seemed like she didn't know it was him. He asked if she had confused him with someone else. Then the young lady, in turn, was taken aback. She didn't know what to answer. A moment later, she said that, unfortunately, she had poor vision in the dark, so she mistook him for someone else. He looked at the young lady with anger, as her words made him very angry. He looked at her intently and asked what she was doing here without a lamp. Irene sighed heavily and said that she had forgotten something here. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was in such a hurry to return the lost item that she came here in the middle of the night. The young lady, in turn, was a little puzzled. She did not know what to do since she could not think of a suitable excuse. He looked at her closely and said that she wasn't even making excuses. Otis sighed heavily and said that he didn't know how to accept this situation at all. The longer she continued to behave like this, the more bad thoughts crept into his head. She came in the middle of the night to the greenhouse where no one comes, and she was not even surprised to bump into someone. He looked at her closely as he saw that her outfit looked as if she was in a great hurry. Otis came closer to her as he wanted to know the reason why she was so stingy with words. He looked at her closely and asked if she was trying to arrange a secret meeting. He looked at her with fury and asked her to say that it was not so. The young lady, in turn, froze in place in surprise. She did not know what to answer. Otis was angry. He looked at her with fury. He did not understand at what moment her confused heart yearning for her was deceived. He always thought that he liked her as a person. For him, who grew up alone under the guise of luxury love, was just an unnecessary feeling. Then, denial became the only way to get rid of this loneliness. He lived his life believing that love was something unattainable. That's why, when he looked at her, his chest tightened, and when she smiled while talking to her brother, everything inside him turned upside down. He deceived himself out of anger at having his playmate taken away from him. He dated different people at Henrietta's request. Otis talked to the girls she recommended. But admiration and curiosity disappeared as soon as he looked into the multicolored eyes of all the people. In the end, they were mixed with contempt and desire. He stood quietly in the distance and watched all the guests as always. A moment later, he heard people talking. They were talking about the Rowans area and about Devil's Lake. He froze for a moment and thought, The first thing that came to his mind was the smile blossoming on her beautiful and indifferent face. The young lady had told him that someday she really wanted to visit the sea or a lake. This image clearly reminded him of Felkin's poetry. As if mocking his attempts to get away from her and Lavrenti, he looked at the young lady intently and said that if she told the truth, he would close his eyes to the matter. She looked at him intently and with a heavy sigh said that to tell the truth, she was going to meet the footman. Otis froze in shock. She said that during the day they were both busy and worked far from each other, so only night was left. Otis sighed heavily, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked intently at the young lady, and taking her face tenderly, said that he did not seem to have told her that she was absolutely incapable of lying. She looked at the young gentleman intently, and said that it was he who was forcing her to tell this clumsy lie. Irene sighed and said that he himself did not believe her. He looked at her sharply and asked if there was another reason why she acted as if she was expecting someone in the greenhouse in the middle of the night. She looked at him sharply and said that was definitely the case. She told him to be quiet because there was a suspicious person in the mansion. Otis froze in surprise, as she was acting completely differently now. She knew that the young master was a very unpredictable person. She knew that he was a spy who was nearby and could notice the pursuit. Irene understood perfectly well what she should do in such a case. She slowly took his hand and said that he should first move away with her. He looked at her in surprise and asked why they were hiding. Otis was a little surprised, since she said that there was someone suspicious in the mansion. She looked intently at the young gentleman and said that she had followed in his footsteps. He thought for a moment about the suspicious man she had just told him about. He wondered if this was the spy his brother had recently spoken about. He looked at the young lady with a smirk as he realized that it was all about him. She sighed heavily and said that if she had known that this would happen, she would really have gone on a secret date. He looked closely at the young lady, for she did not even suspect how relieved he felt when the name of Louise, who had captured her love, or her brother, did not escape her lips. He looked at her intently and with lightning speed hugged her and said that she could arrange a secret meeting with him. The young lady froze for a moment. He looked at her with a smile and said that she should tell him everything in detail. He wanted to know everything about the spy. Otis looked at the young lady and asked if she had kept silent because she was afraid that she would have difficulty catching him if things got serious. He looked at her closely and asked if it was because she didn't trust them. Irene sighed heavily and said that they knew who and where could overhear them, so she thought for some time to act carefully. She sighed heavily and said that since this was how it was, she couldn't hide it any longer. Irene looked at the young gentleman and said that she had observed his suspicious movements. She said that the spy was heading towards the greenhouse and then disappeared, and later she came across the young gentleman. She sighed heavily and said that she had not thought at all that she would discuss this with him. She slowly walked closer to him and asked in surprise if he really knew about everything. The young master said casually that all the brothers knew about the spy in their house, and for them it was not such surprising news. He said with a gentle smile that it was very funny that he had come to ask her to tell a story that she had not told them because of her mistrust. Irene looked at him in bewilderment. She sighed heavily and said that she should have told them about this earlier. She lit the candles slowly. Irene sighed heavily and said that this time he had to help her. She said that unfortunately, she had missed the spy's tears, so she didn't know if she would have another chance to follow him. The gentleman looked at the young lady intently and said that they need to make him appear. She became excited, looked at him and asked how they could do this. He said with a grin that they could create a very tasty news item. He smiled and said that, for example, a scandal between him and her would be of great interest to a spy. The young lady in turn froze in place from surprise and embarrassment. She did not expect to hear anything like this at all. The young man was a little excited, and it seemed to him that this was very strange, since he knew that what he was looking for was in the box. He was puzzled, since he understood that if he lost it, then he would not forget it. The young man slowly approached him and asked what he was doing. He looked at the young man mockingly and said that now he understood what kind of rat was rummaging through the boxes at such a late hour. He looked at the young man with fury as he realized that he was the artist's assistant. The young man told him that he had frightened him very much, told him that it was he himself who was wandering here in the middle of the night. He told him that he was also wandering and that he should not be blamed alone for this. He looked angrily at the artist's assistant and asked if they were really in the same situation. He shouted at him that he had worked hard here. For some time they continued to quarrel. The young man was furious as he realized that now even the little children were bullying him. He sighed heavily because he knew that if it weren't for the high salary, he wouldn't even think about setting foot in such an infuriating mansion. He sighed heavily because he knew that it was all because of that girl. He was puzzled that the maid was simply throwing herself at the young masters and climbing to the top. He sighed heavily as if he had known that everything would be like this. He would have gone to Delton, where his brother lived, and would have worked there. The maid slowly approached him and said with a smile that she did not think to take him away. She smiled and said that she was leaving. She was not the only one who thought exactly that way. He was surprised because he did not expect to see Miriam so late in the evening. She asked with a smirk if he really thought that the whole mansion revolved around that child. She was puzzled that the senior gentleman had given her authority over the senior maid. She sighed heavily and said that it was unknown when she would begin to manage the mansion as she pleased. She looked closely at the young man and asked if he agreed with her opinion. The maid sighed heavily and said that she really wanted to return to those times when Madame Henrietta was in the mansion. When the man sighed heavily, he did not understand what the young master saw in her indifference. He said that she always had a face like a statue. The maid smiled and laughed. She said that he compared her perfectly. She looked closely at the young man and asked with a grin how they could remove this sculpture from the mansion. The young man looked closely at the maid and with a sly grin said that it seemed she had plenty of courage since she wanted to kick Irene out of the mansion. She looked at him and asked with a smirk if they wouldn't be much more comfortable. Then the young man stood behind the bushes and listened to their conversation. Irene looked at the young gentleman in surprise and asked if he really wanted to make a scandal. He looked at her with a sly smile and said that that was exactly it. He looked at her intently and said that in a few days he was going to the Marquise's birthday party. Irene thought about it as she did not expect to hear anything like that. He looked at the young lady intently and said that if they went there together, then a situation would arise sufficient to create a scandal. She froze for a moment, as she knew that this was the main romantic episode between Louise and Otis. The episode was called The Beginning of the Lark's Banquet Hall. Even if we leave aside the fact that he chose her, she would not want to be where Louise should be in her place. He looked closely at the young lady and said that they would have to appear together more often. He said that this had happened before and that it would not be so easy to provoke the public. She slowly moved away from him and said that she would be better off going there with Louise. He looked at the young lady intently and asked if she would like to spend the night in his room. Then she froze in shock, as she did not understand what he was saying. Otis looked at her intently and said that a man and a woman leaving the same room early in the morning would be the best scandal to come up with. Otis smiled tenderly at her and said that he certainly didn't mind if she went beyond acting. The young lady, in turn, was a little angry. She knew that she should not be mistaken. She knew perfectly well that his smile was not intended for her. She knew that the poison was hers. He looked closely at the young lady and asked her what she thought about it. He touched her face tenderly and said that it was a very good plan. She knew that it was poison that she had already swallowed once. There was a time when she truly loved Otis, when they gave each other the warmth of hugs, trying to ease their loneliness. Then they believed that their time would never end. She was pretty exhausted after living several lives. She sighed heavily. She knew that this time the ending would be bad. She knew that if she survived all the endings and could not return, she did not know what to do then. She was puzzled because she knew she would be left with lives without hope and endless tragedies that would tear her heart apart. But what is even harder is the feeling of loneliness. In a moment of despair, Otis told her what she most wanted to hear. He looked at her intently and said that he needed her very much. Then he said that only she could comfort him. Even knowing that she would be tied hand and foot, even if this warmth was fleeting to come, she could not help but fall in love with him. Every time he spoke kind words to her, the anxiety blazing inside her subsided. He said with a gentle smile that she was the only one he had. She mistakenly believed that if they were together, she could endure an endless repeating life. Louise knocked on the young gentleman's door and asked if they could talk. The young lady in turn was taken aback. She did not expect to see Louise. She asked his forgiveness for coming to him so late as she wanted to see him. Irene was stunned to the spot. She asked where the gentleman was going. She called him, but it was all in vain. She froze in shock as she realized he had left her. Until this moment, she was blind and did not know something obvious. She didn't know that during the episode that was crucial for reaching the finale, the system excluded minor characters. The system excluded people like her. As soon as Louise came to the young master, she immediately disappeared. She was puzzled and thought that it would be better for her not to know this care, then she would not be so sad. She did not want to feel the loneliness that was overtaking her again. She knew that it was enough to give up the thoughts that she meant something in this world. She looked at the young master sadly because she knew that now she would not love him. She sighed heavily and said that she thought it was wrong because his feelings for her were not sincere. He looked at the young lady intently as he was saddened. He did not expect to hear such a thing from her. He slowly took her hand and said that he did not know that she still believed in love. Irene looked at the young gentleman intently. She was a little puzzled and did not understand why he had such a sad expression on his face. A moment later, she was taken aback as she heard someone walking. Otis said that it was his brother's footsteps. The young lady froze in place in surprise. She did not expect to hear that Archibald would be walking around late in the evening. She did not know what he was doing here. She was very excited and did not know what to do in such a situation. She understood perfectly well that it would be very awkward if they met. She remembered how he asked her why she hadn't told him that there was a spy in the mansion. Then he asked her if she really didn't trust him that much. Irene in turn thought that she was lucky. Since then, she hadn't encountered Archibald. But now, she was very worried that she might meet him since the situation was not pleasant. Otis looked at the young lady intently and asked if she didn't want her older brother to know she was here. She looked at the young gentleman in surprise, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, the young gentleman, with the speed of lightning, picked her up in his arms and looked at her with a soft smile. She was in shock and did not understand what he was doing now. She was embarrassed because she did not expect to find herself in his arms at all. He slowly and easily laid her on the bed and began to cover her with a blanket. The young lady looked at the young gentleman in bewilderment. He looked at her intently and said that if she hid, Archibald would not notice her. He said that if he thought she was sleeping, he would leave immediately. He looked at the young lady with a gentle smile and said that she could just sleep here until the morning. Looking at the young lady with a predatory but gentle smile, he said that the planned scandal would then come true. Irene was very puzzled by his words. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really had to wrap her up like that. He smiled and said that if she attacked, she wouldn't know who was behind her. He gently told her that now she should just close her eyes and try to sleep. Irene was a little excited as she could hear the young master's heartbeat. She sighed heavily as it once sounded to her. She still sometimes missed him and wanted to return to the young master's arms. Sometime later, the young lady was sleeping quietly in bed. Otis looked at her intently. He sighed heavily, looking at the lady, and said that even if she didn't want him, it was okay. He really wanted her to need only him. Opening her eyes, the young lady noticed that it was already morning. With the speed of lightning, she sat down on the bed and, looking around, began to search for the young master. A moment later, she noticed that he was sitting quietly on the sofa, sleeping. She was surprised that he slept like that all night. The young lady was puzzled. If she had known that everything would be like this, she would have returned to her room. She slowly walked closer to him. She sighed heavily as she realized that she had inadvertently taken up the entire bed. She unconsciously reached out to the young master. He quickly opened his eyes and grabbed her hand. He asked with his warm smile if she was awake. The young lady in turn was taken aback as she did not expect him to wake up like that. She asked him for forgiveness. She was taken aback and, looking at the master, said that she had not noticed how she had fallen asleep. He smiled and said that there was nothing to worry about, and by that time, the other servants had just woken up. He looked at the young lady with a satisfied grin and said that now they could no longer avoid a scandal. She sighed heavily and said that everything happened as he said. She said that in that case, she should leave the room. He grabbed her hand and asked her to wait a little. The young gentleman looked at the young lady with a smile and said that, unfortunately, no one looks neat after a night with a lover. She froze in surprise. He slowly tousled her hair. She looked closely at the young gentleman and asked if he could make one mark at the back. Irene looked at the young gentleman intently and said that this trace would be irrefutable evidence. He froze in shock as he did not expect to hear anything like this. He looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she was really serious now. She looked intently at the young master and said that this should excite the whole house. He was taken aback and, looking at the young lady, said that she did not want anything like that. She sighed heavily and thinking said that this also concerned him. She sighed heavily and said that everyone present could not be fooled by one disheveled appearance, and they needed something more. He sighed heavily and said that sometimes she really did act unexpectedly for him. He looked closely at the young lady and said that it was she who forced him, and he had no reason to refuse. He looked at the young lady with a predatory smile and said that he had no choice but to obey her order. He touched her neck gently and calmly. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that she should not worry. She sighed heavily, as she knew it was just a game. Otis looked into his brother's office and said that he heard Archibald was looking for him. Archibald sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, there had been a commotion in the house since early morning, and there was no one left who was not aware of it. He said that he was really curious about what these rumors were. Archibald looked at his brother with fury and told him to immediately explain to him what was going on. Otis looked at his brother with a mocking smirk and said that he was not sure what was going on. Archibald looked at his brother with fury and asked how he was acting. Otis, in turn, only smiled at his brother. The man looked at him intently and said that he was very disappointed in him. The man said that no matter how much he asked him to leave, he did not leave. He said that taking the 7th district from Veronica was impolite to his elders. The man shouted that Veronica was unpleasantly shocked that she had to miss the meeting. Archibald knew perfectly well that this could show traces of loyalty, but he did not understand why they were so supportive of Veronica. He thought it was most likely because of the illegal stand she ran in the 7th district. Now that he had restored it, his stomach was twisted from the loss of a huge profit. The man was furious and asked how much longer he could undermine the prestige of the elders who were loyal to Knox. He shouted furiously that this was against the organizational hierarchy. He had once been told that where there was great power and hierarchy, there was no room for loyalty. He knew that he must not forget that everything existed for its own benefit. He knew that he could not trust anyone, not even himself. Archibald looked angrily at everyone present and said that, unfortunately for them, his aunt had been doing a poor job with the ledger. He looked at them closely and said that they could let him know if they had any disagreements. He said that if they checked it themselves, their heads would remain on their shoulders. Archibald looked at his brother with fury and said that he was behaving inappropriately. Otis looked at his brother with a sneer and said that even though he was busy at an executive meeting, the rumors had still reached him. Archibald was very angry with his brother for causing a scandal right in their house. Otis told his brothers that they deal with blood every day, and he only gets it because of this rumor. Archibald angrily threw a stack of documents at his brother. He said that he must understand that now is not the time for this. He shouted that because of the talk about his wedding, because his mother threw him out of the secular world, aristocrats are sensitive to rumors and measure everything by them. Otis looked at his brother closely and asked if they really bothered him. He looked hard at Archibald and said that, if that was not the case, he believed the cause of the uneasiness was that the young lady was avoiding him. Archibald glared at his brother and told him to be careful with his words. Otis looked at his brother with a predatory smile on his face as he realized he had hit the bull's eye. He knew perfectly well that next to his brother, he was always second. He said mockingly that such a sharp reaction to a scandal was not like his brother. He enjoyed the fact that this time he was first. Otis looked at his brother closely and said with a smile that no matter what he said, he and she were thinking of going to Rowan's. Archibald looked at his brother with anger and surprise and asked if he was really going there with the young lady. The young gentleman smiled and said that she had already agreed. Archibald glared at his brother, but said nothing. A moment later, he said that since the maid could not be taken from the mansion so easily, he would speak to the young lady about it. Otis looked at his brother closely and said with a smile that it was a very sensible idea. He said that his older brother could be anything to her. Archibald looked at his brother closely and said that of course it was like that for partners, he could be too. It was their brotherly promise they had to hide their passion for the young lady. They shouldn't have shown jealousy, knowing what the end would be if they couldn't hide their desire. As long as they stood behind that precarious line, neither of them would lose her. Archibald looked at his brother with fury, as he could not accept the fact that she had chosen him. He sighed heavily, and looking at his brother, asked if he hadn't said that the young lady's thoughts were already occupied by someone. He said that whatever they thought about her, he did not have time to finish his thought when suddenly he heard the bright laughter of his brother. He looked at Archibald closely and said that in that case, she would leave their house and lose trust in them. He asked his brother if he really intended to just watch from afar. Archibald grabbed his brother by the clothes in anger. He looked at his brother with anger in his eyes and told him not to provoke him by using the young lady in conversation. Otis looked at his brother sharply and said that he would do as he was told, and from that moment on, he would stop towing the line. He looked closely at his brother and said with a satisfied smile that he no longer wanted to hide his desire. Otis rode slowly in the carriage and thought about everything he knew that his brother would not reproach him anymore. He knew perfectly well that although his brother had something on his mind, he would not show it. He was interested in what they would do together with the young lady in Rowan's. He really wanted to take a walk around the Blue Lake area with the young lady. He really wanted to read her a love poem on the lake shore. He knew that then they would have pleasant conversations, and then she would change her mind about leaving the mansion. He knew that instead of the maid's uniform, she would wear the dress he had given her, and then she would shine brighter than anyone else at the ball. He knew that she would look at him with gratitude and warmth. Otis knew that she would smile only at him, her soft smile. He sighed heavily because he knew perfectly well that this was just his delusion. He knew perfectly well that she would always be cold and distant. He sighed heavily because he knew that he had answered his brother proudly. Even though he had little idea what he was talking about, he was truly sorry. The maids whispered to each other, as they were sure that something like this would happen. Someday, they said that the young lady had left the young master's room. They watched her closely, wondering what was really going on between them. The young lady, in turn, was puzzled. She knew that the mansion was huge, but rumors spread so quickly. She was very glad that she had put in eye drops in advance. She knew that if this went on, it would be much easier to find the spy. Everyone was puzzled, as a simple servant dared to create a scandal in the mansion. They said mockingly that such things did not happen under Madame Henrietta. A moment later, young Lydia noticed the light emanating from the servant. Irene looked closely at the maid Mariam, who had been working in the mansion for a very long time. Irene knew perfectly well that if the maid were a spy, she would have to move around to find out more detailed information, but they only saw her engaging in useless gossip. She understood perfectly well that the likelihood of the handmaid being a spy was very low. She knew that Eden's servant had left a glowing trail behind him, so it was no wonder that the artist's assistant had touched his tools. The news of her resignation had leaked out earlier, and she knew he simply wasn't the right fit for the job. She simply ruled him out as a suspect. She understood perfectly well who was left now. She knew that she could only pay attention to the footman Joseph. At first glance, it seemed like there was no connection, but Joseph has an older brother, who in the original story was a member of the Deltona group. Right at the end with Otis, he went over to his brother's side and betrayed Knox. She wondered what if he had been found with a luminous substance. She could only assume that he was a real spy. She knew that in that case, she had to check the letters Louise had sent to Henrietta. She mentally apologized to Louise for doubting her, but even in the original story, Louise was unknowingly playing the role of a spy. A moment later, after a long search, she found the letter. She understood perfectly well that she should not miss such a chance. She looked closely at the letter. As she expected, the letter mentioned pink energy. The young lady was taken aback. She turned around and saw Louise. Louise was puzzled by something. She was shouting to the young lady that they were in trouble. Irene looked at the young maid with concern and asked what had happened. She looked closely at the young lady and said that Lady Charlotte had arrived at the mansion again. Young Lady Charlotte, betrothed to Archibald, she always captivated everyone with her beauty. In the game, she always appeared at an unspecified time, and unfortunately, she thereby created problems for all the servants. Irene knew perfectly well that this time, Charlotte had simply fallen in love with Rodon and had begun to torment Louise. She knew that Charlotte's role was not so important. She knew that she had to quickly inform the young master about the spy. The young lady looked at Louise intently and asked where Mr. Otis was. Louise looked at the lady in surprise, as she did not understand why she needed a second gentleman. Louise was taken aback, and looking at Irene, said that the young gentleman said something about some point, and left. Irene realized that he was talking about the arena in the 7th district. She was puzzled that she was only one step late. She knew that all she had to do was send him a telegram. She looked at the young lady intently and said that she would deal with Lady Charlotte and that she could go. Louise sighed heavily and said that she understood everything. Irene knew very well that a lot of time had passed since the restoration of the 7th district, and now the young gentleman had an increased amount of work. She knew that, unfortunately, she could not ask for help now. She knew that she had to deal with Charlotte right now. Charlotte looked at the maid with contempt and mockery and asked if she really dared to show her face here after making the guest wait for a long time. Irene froze in shock on the spot. She looked at the maid mockingly and asked if she was really going to disappoint her again. Irene bowed and apologized to the young lady. She asked Charlotte what business she had come to see them for today. Charlotte smiled and said that she had come to see her fiancé today. Irene looked intently at the young lady. She understood perfectly well that this was a complete lie and that she had probably come to see Rodon or was tormenting Louise again. She looked at Charlotte intently and, asking for forgiveness, said that the elder gentleman was busy with work until late today. Charlotte smiled and, looking at the maid, said that she could give her permission to have tea with someone else. She said with a satisfied smile that she had already received permission from the lady herself, Henrietta. Irene was a little puzzled. She knew that Otis was not in the mansion, and only Rodon remained. She sighed heavily and said to Charlotte that if it suited her, she could invite the younger gentleman. The young lady's expression changed with lightning speed. She looked intently at the maid and asked if she would really drink tea with Rodon. Irene looked at the young lady intently and said that if she wished to die, she could convey the message of the day to the first gentleman. Charlotte was taken aback and said that there was no need to do that. She said that she would wait for him as long as it took. A moment later, a young gentleman came out to them and looked at them in surprise. He did not understand what kind of noise they were making. Charlotte in turn looked at the young gentleman with loving eyes. Irene looked intently at the young gentleman and said that Lady Charlotte invited him to tea. He looked at the maid in surprise and, sighing heavily, said that he couldn't stand tea. A moment later, he was taken aback and said that he couldn't stand thirst, and that was very fortunate. Irene, in turn, looked at the young gentleman with bewilderment. She didn't understand why he was acting so suspiciously. She sighed heavily and said that, with their permission, she would take them all to the tea room. The young lady looked after them intently. She was very glad that everything had worked out so well. Irene sighed heavily as she was glad that the letter to the young master had already been sent. She knew that now she had to keep an eye on Joseph and find evidence of espionage. A moment later, she was taken aback as she heard some noise. She looked closely at the maids and asked excitedly where they heard such a thing. The maid was taken aback and said that they went to the tea room. She thought for a moment about what the maids had told her. She was very worried that something might have happened to the young master. She was excited, looked at Louise and asked what happened in the tea room. Louise in turn was excited, screamed and called her. Louise looked closely at the young lady and said excitedly that the young gentleman had lost consciousness. Irene froze in shock and immediately turned pale from the news. She was puzzled and wondered if the young master was unconscious now. She was puzzled because she understood that this was the same episode. She was taken aback for a moment as she was puzzled by the fact that the time did not match. Irene knew that there was nothing like that in the portrait covered in blood. Louise looked excitedly at the lady she had found and called her. Irene knew perfectly well that the ending was not yet imminent. She did not understand why everything was happening this way. She remembered how the young gentleman looked at her with a farewell smile and asked her to take his hand one last time. She remembered how he had thanked her with a smile for his small request. She looked closely at the young lady and said that she was fine and that it was important to quickly call a doctor and call the older gentleman's. She glanced sideways, alarmed at Louise, and said that she would immediately see what was happening in the tea room. Entering the room, she froze in shock as she saw the entire mess that reigned in the room and Charlotte, who was looking tenderly at the young master. Irene looked at the young lady with fury and asked what she was going to do. She looked at her closely and wondered if she was really going to kiss someone who was unconscious. She looked closely at the young gentleman who was lying on the ground. He was very defenseless. Charlotte was in shock. She did not understand what had happened and why the maid had entered the room without even knocking. Irene looked at Charlotte with fury and asked what she had just said. She was very angry because Charlotte decided to harm the young master. She angrily asked Charlotte what she had just done to the master. Charlotte was taken aback and, looking at the maid, said that she was the one who wanted to ask about this. She in turn only secretly poured some love potion from the mistress into the cup. She was puzzled and did not understand why everything had suddenly turned out this way. She was taken aback and, with a timid smile, asked if the young gentleman had really done something wrong. Irene looked at the young lady with fury and said that she would forgive her rudeness because she was their guest, but now she had gone too far. she said with fury, the young lady that she would regret ever setting foot on the threshold of their house. Charlotte, in turn, froze in shock on the spot. She did not expect to hear anything like that from the maid. She looked at the maid with fury and wondered if she was really threatening her. Now Charlotte was on edge. She didn't understand how a simple maid could boldly say something like that to her. She swung her arm angrily, knowing she looked ridiculous in his eyes. In turn, Archibald came to them very quickly. He grabbed her hand in anger and asked what she was doing. Charlotte froze in fear. She looked timidly at the young master and said that she only wanted to teach the maid some manners. After her words, he angrily pushed the young lady away, and she screamed because she did not expect anything like this. The young gentleman quickly approached the maid and asked if she was okay. Irene sighed and said that she was fine, but unfortunately, the young gentleman was not feeling well. The young lady, alas, was in shock in her turn. She did not understand what was happening. She remembered the words about the maid Irene. The young lady said that she would regret that she had given in on the threshold of their house. She looked closely at Louise and told her to prepare the bed for the young master. Louise sighed heavily and quickly said that she would do everything. Charlotte looked closely at the maid, as she knew it was she who ran the cruel house. Joseph was a little puzzled because he felt like someone was watching him, but now he was really afraid for himself. He was a little puzzled and wondered how he could get out of the estate quietly. A moment later, he realized that he could use the artist's carriage when he returned to Lichfield. He knew that he would first frighten him at dawn, leave unnoticed and hide. He understood perfectly well that until then, he could not die. Archibald looked closely at the butler and said that he had returned on time. The young man said that he had carried a letter from Mr. Otis. Archibald slowly brought the letter from his brother. He sighed heavily and said that Lichfield's woman, unfortunately, will never get tired of it. He was puzzled since they even bribed the Fermani. The young man looked at the gentleman in surprise and asked if he was really talking about Joseph Furman. He was surprised because he knew that the young man had been working for them for a long time. Archibald sighed heavily and said that everything was exactly like that, but he was going to run away with the artist that morning. The butler was surprised that the master already knew about it. Archibald sighed heavily and said that the young man had long been suspected. He said that the artist's assistant had a good sense. He caught Joseph blackmailing and complained. The young master looked at the young man and said that he would leave it to his discretion. Archibald looked at the young man with a grin and said that his aunt had left something in the mansion. He smiled and said that they should return it to her. Sometime later at Lichfield's mansion, Mrs. Veronica was informed that she had received a letter and a gift from Lavrenti. Veronica looked at her service in surprise. She didn't expect to receive a gift. She looked closely at the small box and said that it looked like there was some kind of outfit in there. She sighed heavily and said with a smile that it looked like Archibald had matured late, but she was still glad that he had sent the gift. She was very surprised and at the same time unspeakably happy that he sent a beautiful outfit to his aunt. She slowly opened the box with the gift. After opening the box, she was horrified and quickly recoiled from it. She did not expect to see anything like this. A moment later, she realized that she was now seeing the head of a footman in front of her. She began to read the letter from your nephew. He wrote to her that having heard that, due to poor health, she was unable to attend the meeting of elders. He was sending her something that she had forgotten at their place and hoped that the flowers had arrived safely. He wished her a speedy recovery. Veronica was furious because she realized that he couldn't do anything for her. She was furious because he couldn't cope on his own. She said with fury that it was natural. Henrietta walked slowly into the laboratory and said with a grin that it was always a mess there. She looked at the madam with a grin and told her to order the services, and they would quickly clean up everything in the laboratory. Edith looked at Hungary with rage and did not say that if she came to grumble, then she could go back to her place. Henrietta sighed heavily with a smile and said, "Madam, that talking is not her strong point." She looked at Henrietta intently and asked what brought her here. Henrietta smiled and said that the madams were simply heartless. Henrietta said she wanted to tell him she was sending Charlotte to the Laurenti house. Edith looked at her intently and said that this time the girl would not return so easily. Henrietta smiled and said that she had brought her from the very beginning for this very purpose. She looked at Madame with fury and said that she was badly hurt. Edith looked at her in surprise and asked why all of a sudden. Henrietta smiled and said that it seemed she had given Charlotte the potion without her knowledge. She said that she should not have given the drug to a girl of hollow ambition. Henrietta looked at her sharply and said that this had greatly interfered with her plans. Henrietta said that Charlotte was trying to lure Archibald, and if she succeeded, they would have to save another young lady. Charlotte glared at Madame and told her angrily to be careful. She sighed heavily and said that she would try to do it. Edith sighed heavily and said that she still had a lot of things to do, so she couldn't leave for this. Henrietta looked at Madame intently and asked with a smile if she already knew the news. Edith sighed and told Henrietta that she had frightened her. She asked what she was talking about. Henrietta looked at her closely and asked if she remembered a maid named Irene. She thought for a moment, as she had heard that name somewhere. Henrietta smiled and did not say that this girl who often played with their children was also their nanny. Henrietta looked at her intently and said that she heard that she was dating her son. She told the news for a while. A moment later, she remembered the girl, for it was her name that was Irenea. She was the only servant whose name she remembered sympathetically. The madam looked closely at her son and called him. He smiled a radiant smile and looked closely at his mother. He quickly ran up to her. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he had been very obedient today. He told his mother that he was a very kind child. She looked at him closely and asked if there were any other side effects. He smiled and said there were none. She sighed heavily and said that it was very good. A moment later, she handed him the medicine and said that it was time to take it. The young master sighed heavily and looked closely at the medicine. A moment later, he looked at his mother with a beaming smile and said that he really liked the color purple. A moment later, he timidly asked if he could go out for a walk once he had taken all his pills. She looked at him intently, and as she left, she said that he would be able to do it. She said that if the experiment was successful, he would be able to go out, so he should be patient. The young man was very glad to hear this. He looked intently at his mother, who was slowly walking away from him, and said with a smile that he would do everything. Some time later, Madame was in her laboratory, conducting experiments. She sighed heavily, as she knew that everything would go well. She was very confused and tired. She no longer knew how much time she had spent in the laboratory. For this reason, it seemed to her that she had forgotten something very important. She looked at the bottle of pills in surprise. She didn't understand where the bottle of pills that she had put away because of the side effects came from out. A moment later, she realized that she had made a big mistake. Edith was very excited and puzzled as she realized that the drugs had been switched. She ran to her son with lightning speed. She knew that she could not be late for him. She knew that he was probably not out of control yet. She knew that Elios's spellcasters easily mastered his power, but lost their composure and their personality. So as Rodon grew older, she made increasingly stronger preparations in order to concentrate him. But unfortunately, she couldn't do this. She understood that now her son was like a time bomb. She broke into my room and noticed that the maid was hugging her son tightly. The young lady quietly hugged the young gentleman. She whispered to him that everything would be fine. Madame froze in shock at the door. She did not understand what had happened and how she had managed to calm him down. She understood perfectly well that it was impossible to simply calm Elios's anger. She was in shock because the maid's mind and everything worked out. She froze in surprise on the spot because she was very curious about it. She looked closely at the young maid as she understood that the girl was calm and sensible beyond her years. Edith understood that the maid was not at all like any adult. It seemed to her that the young lady had found out everything from the very beginning. She looked closely at the maid and asked how she managed it. Irene looked at Madame in surprise and asked what exactly she managed to do. Edith told the young lady that she would like to know how she managed to put her son to bed. Irene sighed heavily and said that it was easier than it seemed and that she just needed to exchange the young gentleman. Madame in turn was surprised and did not understand how the young lady found out about this. Irene said that when the master throws things around, she stops him. Madame looked at the young maid in surprise and asked if he was really starting to obey her. The young lady in turn said that he obeys her perfectly. Madame asked the girl what her name was. A moment later, the young lady introduced herself. Madame in turn thought for a moment. Moments later, the madame looked closely at the young lady and said that from this day on, she was responsible for her son. She knew that she needed to keep a little more eye on her son. Irene and Archibald were in the young master's room. The young lady looked at the young master intently. She was very puzzled and didn't know why he hadn't woken up yet. Archibald sighed heavily and said that this was the first time he had encountered such a poison. He did not know whether the poison threatened his brother's life. He was puzzled since the composition of the drug was still unknown, The doctor looked closely at the gentleman and said that, unfortunately, he was not able to make an antidote. He believed that Madame Edith could do something. The young lady in turn sighed and became sad. She knew that it could not be poison because the lady took great care of and valued her son. Archibald looked closely at the young lady and said that she should go and rest before she became ill. He said that she herself had recently recovered from an illness. The young lady sighed heavily but did not answer. She knew that the young master was not dying, but if he lost control of himself, trouble would be inevitable. She knew that if she did not calm him down in time, everything would end. She was very puzzled and scared. Irene understood that her repetitive life would return to her. She did not want to return to those long hours that she had to endure alone. She was puzzled because she knew that no matter how she fought for the future, it was out of her reach. She was puzzled and did not want to start all over again. Panic gripped the young lady. Archibald looked at her with concern and called out. He saw that she was losing control of herself. Irene was in shock. She couldn't breathe. She was losing herself in the depths of the pool of her thoughts and experiences. The young gentleman quickly grabbed her hand and pulled her towards him, kissing her. The young lady froze in shock on the spot. She did not expect anything like this, but still she obeyed him, and it became easier for her to breathe, and memories of that day surfaced in her mind. She wondered if it was just an accident. Irene, in turn, looked intently at the young gentleman. Archibald slowly turned on some beautiful music. He was informed that a guest had come to see him. He looked at the maid in surprise and asked if he had seen her before. She sighed heavily and said that she had recently started working here. A moment later, he said that he now understood where she was so familiar to him from, and he also asked her name. The young lady slowly introduced herself. A moment later, he greeted her with a smile and called her name. She froze in surprise because she knew that he was kind. The master called the services by a short name. She stood in front of the young master. She felt like a mistress. He smiled at her with a radiant smile and said that there were still unfamiliar faces here. She looked at him in surprise, still not understanding what he was talking about. The young lady, in turn, was very confused by his words. With the speed of lightning, she ran to the door and, asking for forgiveness, said that she would go. She stood frozen behind the door, embarrassed. She understood that he was a young gentleman, a true heartbreaker. That was the kind of person he was, for her, before something sad happened. Louise looked closely at the young lady, a smile on her face. She smiled and told the young lady that today had been a lot of fun. Irene looked at Louise in surprise and asked if it was okay for her to spend her vacation with her. Louise hugged the young lady tenderly and said that, of course, there was nothing wrong with eating with her. It was very good. A moment later, they stopped at the entrance as it started to rain. Irene told Louise to wait for her here, as she would bring an umbrella. Quickly, Louise was surprised and asked the young lady to wait a little. Louise was a little puzzled, as she knew that the young lady might get wet and catch a cold if she ran so fast in the rain. A moment later, she was taken aback as she heard someone calling her. She turned around and froze in place as she saw young people. They scared her very much. The young lady, in turn, looked intently at what was happening. Unfortunately, she already knew this plot. Louise is kidnapped by bandits, and Archibald, already darkened by the death of his brother, takes advantage of this to punish all the villains. The ending of the love story between Louise and Archibald. She knew that if the plot was true, then she would be able to return to reality very soon. She really hoped for this. She mentally asked Louise for forgiveness for this, since she had not gone to make the girl suffer. Louise, in turn, screamed and called for the young lady. Louise hurriedly shouted at the young lady to run quickly, and without looking back, Irene froze in shock when she heard the young lady's words. She was furious because she knew she shouldn't interfere. She knew perfectly well that this was the scenario, but still she couldn't just stand by and watch this happen. She quickly grabbed the young lady's hand and pulled her away. Louise froze in surprise and called out to her friend. She didn't expect that from her. Irene looked askance at the young lady and told her to follow her and not stick her head out, as it was dangerous. She blocked the young lady with her body and looked at the young men with her fury. In turn, the bandits laughed. The young man looked at his accomplice with a grin and did not ask what they should do now. But a moment later, young Lydia angrily struck the young bandit on the head with an umbrella. He fell to the ground with a crash. He was shocked because he did not expect such a thing. He screamed and swore at the young lady with rage. He shouted at his accomplices not to just stand aside, but to quickly grab her. The young lady was in shock as she realized that there were too many of them. A moment later, the young man grabbed Louise. He pressed her throat with his hands. The young lady in turn screamed and called for Louise. Louise, in turn, was not at a loss in this situation. She quickly bit the man on the hand, and he involuntarily screamed. He did not expect such a thing. He looked at the lady with fury. He shouted that she was very impudent. He did not understand how she dared to bite him with her lightning speed. He pulled out a knife. Irene screamed, as she did not expect that he would raise a knife to the lady. Irene quickly shielded the young lady with her body, causing the man to strike her body. Louise was shocked. She didn't expect anything like that. A moment later, the young lady fell to the ground with a crash. Louise quickly rushed to her. She called her, but unfortunately, it was all in vain. Louise was in shock, screaming and calling for the only lady. She looked at her with tears in her eyes and asked her to wake up. A moment later, the young man struck Louise, and she lost consciousness. The man was furious, as he understood that in appearance, they were like ordinary ladies, but unfortunately, he had to mess with them. Irene slowly turned over, writhing in pain. She continued to call for Louise, but all her attempts were unsuccessful. With tears in her eyes, she asked Louise for forgiveness for putting her through this. She cried because she understood that she could no longer change anything in this situation. She sat quietly in the rain, writhing in unbearable pain. Archibald slowly approached the young lady and asked why she had acted so recklessly. She looked at the young gentleman in surprise, as she did not expect to see him. She looked at him intently and, writhing in pain, said that Miss Louise had been kidnapped. He sighed heavily and said that he knew she had been kidnapped. He looked at the young lady intently and said that all she had to do was not interfere, but she decided otherwise. She sighed heavily, as she knew that Archibald already knew about everything. He threw away his umbrella and came closer to her. He looked at her with his fury and asked if she saw what her arrogance had led to. He looked at her with fury and told her not to be mistaken, as she could not do anything. Archibald's cold words pierced her heart. Now she realized that she was just a secondary character. He reminded her of the worthlessness of her existence, and this made her even more unhappy. He looked closely at the young lady and asked if she had calmed down now. She was frozen with shock and could not say a word to him. He looked at the young lady closely and asked for forgiveness. He said that he would find it difficult to breathe. She sighed heavily and said that he did not have to apologize. She was puzzled and did not understand at all why he was pressing against her like that. She sighed heavily and said that everything was fine. Otis froze in shock on the spot outside the door. He was puzzled as he did not expect to see such a thing. At the same time, the young gentleman was lying on the bed and writhing in pain. The young lady in turn looked at the gentleman with alarm and called him. A moment later, she looked at him intently and asked if he was awake already. He looked at the young lady with a gentle smile and said that he knew she would be by his side. She looked at him intently and said with a soft smile that everything would be as before. Moments later, she felt that he was very hot. She slowly touched his forehead and realized that he was simply burning and had a fever. Archibald looked closely at his brother and, sighing heavily, said that it seemed he had woken up and that everything was fine. Rodon looked at his brother with fury. He quickly grabbed the young lady and growled and looked at his brother. The young lady froze in place from shock and surprise. Rodon looked at his brother with fury and anger and told him to go away. The young lady in turn turned around and froze in bewilderment. She unfortunately knew about Rodon in such a state. Excessive suspiciousness of stupidity towards others. Rapid heartbeat. She knew perfectly well that these were all symptoms of Elios's approaching rampage. Archibald looked at the young lady closely and asked if he was thinking the same thing as she. She sighed heavily and said that most likely that was exactly what they were thinking. She was a little surprised, as she knew that now everything was different. She knew what must be because he hugs her. He calms down. A moment later, the young lady said that the danger was over, but she knew that he did not want to let her go. She sighed heavily and said that he was still kind to her. As she left, she said that they would manage. Archibald looked at his brother closely and, sighing heavily, I said that he wasn't sure about that. Archie said that if his brother gets overexcited, they will give him sleeping pills. Archibald was a little worried as he realized that it was unclear what had affected his brother so strongly. The young lady in turn looked intently at the young gentleman and called him. She asked excitedly whether she should meet Miss Eunice. At the same time, Charlotte was sitting in the dungeon and, bursting into tears, begged for someone to let her out. She screamed that she knew nothing. A moment later, a young lady entered the dungeon and asked if she really repented. Charlotte froze in place in surprise as she did not expect to see a maid at all. She joyfully ran up to her and asked if she had really come to free her. With a joyful smile, Charlotte said that she had already told the truth about everything. She looked at the maid closely and said that the young master was fine and safe. She asked the maid with a smile if she could go back to her place. Charlotte, with tears in her eyes, asked the maid to let her out. Irene did not want to listen to the young lady's whining at all. She pulled away from her. Charlotte froze in place from shock, as she did not expect such behavior. Irene looked at the young lady with fury and said that the elder gentleman intended to keep her locked up. Charlotte froze in shock on the spot. She did not expect to hear such a thing at all. She screamed furiously that she didn't want this at all and she didn't like it. She screamed that she didn't like being in the dirty and cramped dungeon. She looked at Charlotte intently and said nothing, but it made her calm down and tone down her ardor. She sighed heavily and told Chernoff that those who had come to help her, Charlotte, looked at the maid in surprise, as she had not expected to hear something like that at all. Charlotte asked if this was really true. Irene looked at her intently and said that everything was exactly like that, and if they could talk normally, then she would soon be released. Looking at Charlotte, she said she would like to discuss her love potion. Charlotte looked at the maid with worry and did not say that she had already told everything, and she did not even know that there was poison there. Charlotte sighed heavily and remembered the conversation with Madame. She said that Madame told her that it was a love potion and it caused an illusion. She looked closely at the maid and said that the love product destroys nerve cells and artificially awakens sympathy. She said that with the help of the love potion, she wanted to arouse the young master's sympathy for the family. Irene, in turn, understood perfectly well that Madame valued rationality and efficiency. She wondered why she would create such a frivolous potion. She thought for a moment about the love and research she had spoken of. As far as she remembered, there had been something about it in her lab. The young lady, in turn, was a little puzzled, since she did not know what Madame had in mind. She felt uneasy somehow, and she wanted to check everything herself. As Irene was leaving, she told Charlotte that she had helped her a lot, and that it was time for her to leave. Charlotte looked at the maid with worry and asked if she was really leaving so easily. Charlotte shouted at the maid to wait. She looked at the maid intently and said that she had not told her everything, but it was simply too strange. She said that when she added the potion to the tea, the master acted suspiciously. She said that he looked at her with a satisfied grin. Charlotte said that he then asked her if she had really put something in his tea, and she froze in surprise, as she had not expected to hear such a question, but in turn, he said with a grin that there was nothing wrong with that, and took the cup of tea. She looked closely at the maid and said that now she knew everything. Irene froze in shock as she realized that the young master had deliberately taken the poison. A few years ago, there was a commotion at the Laurenti mansion. The young lady was surprised, turned around, and looked closely at all the commotion. She was puzzled and did not understand what was going on. Madame shouted that she did not refuse to leave, but she never allowed anyone to enter her laboratory. The maid looked at Madame in confusion and said that it would be hard for her to carry everything alone. Ifil said that she remembered most of the research data, so she was not going to take everything. She shouted at everyone present to leave her lab alone. She looked at them with her fury and did not say that since they could expel them to Lichfen, they should deal with this. She looked at Archibald sharply and asked if it was true, but he looked at her with a gentle smile and said nothing. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that they had a long way to go, but it was all necessary for their good. He smiled and said that if she needed anything else, before he would help her. She sighed heavily and said that he could forget about it since she would be helped. She looked at the young lady intently and did not say that one maid would be enough for her. Irene, in turn, slowly walked with Madame into her laboratory. She was very surprised and at the same time excited since she had entered the laboratory. Madame before she had never been able to do anything like this. Since entry, there was strictly prohibited to everyone. Madame said that she would go to another corner, and she should clean up here. The young lady bowed and told Madame that she would do everything. She was very glad that she had such a chance. She wanted to get to know better all the research of the lady. She knew perfectly well that the lady did not know that she could read. She was glad because this was her chance. She hoped that she could find something very important in this unknown place. She looked through all the materials and was very surprised, since most of them concerned Elios. She froze in surprise for a moment, since she read about the research on luminous substances in eye drops. Moments later, She looked closely at the document as she found what she was looking for. Irene found a report on the study of the connection between love and fate. She was surprised and did not understand why Madame wanted to study this. She wondered if this had anything to do with Elios. The young lady wondered if Madame was the one who followed the connection between the game's sympathy and the ending. She wondered if Madame, like her, had come into this world from another world. She sighed heavily because she knew that this simply could not be true. She understood perfectly well that otherwise the system would have known about this and simply would not have allowed it to happen. She was puzzled and did not know herself how their pores Madame studied such things and why she did it. Irene. It was very interesting how she came up with the idea of the connection between love and fate, but she in turn understood perfectly well that these documents could contain something that would help her return to her world. The madam looked at the maid in surprise and asked her what she was doing. The young lady was taken aback, as she had not heard the madam approaching. Edith looked at the young lady with a smirk and said that she ordered her to clean up and not to read the notebook. She looked at the young lady closely and asked if that was not the case. She looked at the maid intently and did not tell her to tell immediately. She smiled and asked what the secret of reading it and following was. She asked if it did not excite her consciousness. The young lady was taken aback and apologized for looking at a simple book without knowing what category to put it in. She sighed heavily and said that she didn't even want to read it secretly. Madame looked closely at the maid and said that there was nothing wrong with that, since it was encrypted anyway, and Irene simply wouldn't be able to read it. She smiled and said that this material is about the connection between love and destiny. The young lady looked at Madame in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Madame smiled and said that it was indeed unusual, but she believed in destiny. Irene, in turn, understood perfectly well that it was fate that reigned here. She looked intently at Madame and said that this was a very interesting and entertaining topic. The madam looked at the maid with a smile and said that she was very pleased to meet someone who thought so. She said that everyone was looking at her. It was strange when she spoke about such things, because it was funny to look at an explorer who believed in fate. She looked at the young lady intently and asked if anyone had ever thought about how their destiny depended on attachment. She shouted that it was very interesting. She looked intently at the young maid and shouted that perhaps the research would change the future and help the Produce guess the end prepared for them. She shouted that she would immediately and definitely find out about it. Then an interesting thought occurred to her. Irene thought that there was a hidden setting for Madame. She understood that if Madame realized that this world was simply false, fate would stop her exploration. That's what she thought then, but now completely different thoughts were spinning in her head. She remembered the madam. I hoped her research would change the future. She looked intently at Charlotte, to whom I told her that the product destroyed nerve cells and created the illusion of sympathy. She was shocked because she now understood that it was she who had fallen into the trap of history and not Edith. She was furious with herself because she understood that she was wrong. She understood that Madame had begun to put her research into practice. She was furious and wondered why she hadn't thought of breaking the game when it would have been so much easier. For a moment, she stood frozen in place, wondering what would happen to the heroes of the story after she managed to break the story itself. She was furious and knew that she needed to meet with Madame first. She knew perfectly well that she would have to find out what Madame was really hiding. She didn't want to leave the estate at all, but she also knew that this needed to be discussed with the young master. She entered the young master's room and froze in place as she saw a very terrible picture. She froze in place in surprise when she saw Archibald, who was very angry, and Otis, whose face was broken. Archibald slowly knocked on his brother's door. Otis, sitting at the table, said that he did not want to talk to anyone now, but Archibald did not listen to his words. He entered the room. Otis, with fury, asked the young man if he would not hear. Archibald looked at his brother intently and did not say that they needed to talk. He rose up in anger and did not shout that he did not want to do this. Archibald looked at his brother intently and said that he would like to apologize for that incident. The young man looked at his brother with fury. He quickly walked up to Archibald and asked what exactly he wanted to apologize for. The young man angrily asked his brother if he really wanted to apologize for kissing his beloved. He looked at Archibald with anger and asked if he really wanted to apologize for mocking him. Archibald was taken aback and said that before Rodon woke up, the lady began to breathe quickly, and he, in order to calm her down, kissed her. Otis looked at his brother with fury and told him to stop. He shouted that he did not need to justify himself at all, since he knew perfectly well that his brother had a good reason. Otherwise, he would be just a hypocrite who encroached on his brother's belovedy. He said angrily that what made him even more unhappy was that he really didn't have any relationship with Irene. Archibald looked at his brother in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He was surprised because he had heard rumors that were circulating in their mansions. Otis angrily said that the young lady had simply asked him for help. Otis sighed heavily and said that unfortunately they had set it all up. He looked at his brother intently and said that he did not have to apologize to him for anything. Archibald was shocked. He did not expect to hear something like that. He approached his brother and said that if she were his lover, he would kill her. He grabbed his brother by the clothes. He was very angry with him. He looked at his brother with fury and said that no matter how much he pretended to be indifferent, his dirty desires were getting the better of him. A moment later, he pushed his brother away and casually said that he was not the only one who had such desires. He told his brother that since he loved her, he too could destroy her. Archibald froze in anger. The young lady in turn looked at the young gentleman with bewilderment. She did not expect to see anything like this at all. She moved with lightning speed and came closer to them and asked what was going on. Archibald looked closely at the young lady and said that nothing terrible had happened and she need not worry. Otis looked mockingly at his brother as he now recognized the head of the family. He said that it seemed that a quarrel with his brother was nothing to worry about. Archibald looked at his brother with fury and did not tell him to shut his mouth immediately. Otis looked at his brother and said with a smirk that if he had been born a little earlier, he would be in his place now. Leachfin had taught him nothing. Otis laughed hysterically and said that it had taught him everything. He asked his brother if he really had enough humanity to console him. The young lady looked at the young gentleman with fury and shouted at them to stop immediately. She looked at them with fury and asked if it was proper for brothers to quarrel like that. She stood between the brothers and said that Rodon had not yet fully recovered. She shouted that they could not behave like this. She looked intently at Archibald and asked if he knew how many unresolved cases there were in the mansion. She told the gentleman that people of his status should be ashamed of resorting to violence. Otis looked at the young lady with a satisfied smile. He was very glad that she stood up for him. Archibald looked at the young lady closely. He realized that he had made a mistake. Taking all his rage under control, he asked for forgiveness. He said that it seemed that she would take care of his brother's treatment. Sometime later, he left them. The young master was furious as he realized that today he did not think about the consequences. He was puzzled, for in everything connected with the young lady, he found it difficult to maintain his composure. When she stood in front of him, he just wanted to tear his brother, who was standing behind her, to shreds. He could clearly remember his arrogant grin now. Archibald sighed heavily. He had not expected to be able to hit so low. The young lady slowly approached the young gentleman and, asking for forgiveness, said that she called him, but he did not answer. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not understand why she came to him. Irene looked intently at the young gentleman and did not say that she urgently needed to discuss something with him. She looked at him intently and said that it was very important and could not be postponed. He looked at her in surprise and said that they could go to his room.